Hannah Mercer pressed her needle through the quilt alone, the way she always did. Fingers bleeding from cold, she could not afford to heat away. Working by the light of a single candle, while laughter drifted from the church hall 50 yards down the road. Every woman in Coldwater Creek sat inside that circle tonight. Every woman except her. She had stopped asking why. They had made the answer plain enough. But what Hannah could not have known on that ordinary November evening was that the storm rolling in from the north was about to make her the only thing standing between this town and its own destruction. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe to this channel and follow Hannah's journey all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hannah Mercer had not eaten since morning, not because there was nothing in the house. There was dried venison on the shelf and half a jar of preserved peaches she had put up herself in August, but because eating required stopping and stopping, required sitting still long enough for the quiet to find her, and the quiet lately had become the cruelest thing she owned. She pressed the needle through the batting again instead, pulled the thread, set the stitch. Outside the window, the church hall blazed with lamplight. She could hear them from here, even through the November wind. The laughter, the particular bright sound of women who had nowhere else they needed to be gathered around a quilting frame that had been built by the husbands of Coldwater Creek, specifically for occasions like this, the Harvest Aid Circle they called it, though the aid, as far as Hannah could tell, only ever traveled in one direction. She had attended once in the early days. She remembered carrying a plate of sugar cookies to the door and being met by Clara Voss with a smile so thin it barely qualified as a facial expression. "We appreciate the gesture, Hannah," Clara had said. "But the frame seats 12, and we've already filled the chairs." 12 chairs. Hannah had counted 9 women through the window. She did not go back. That had been 14 months ago. She pressed the needle through again, pulled the thread, and did not look at the window. The quilt spread across her lap was nearly finished. 9 pounds of batting she had carded herself sandwiched between a patchwork top she had pieced from worn dresses, an old wool coat belonging to her late father, and 3 flour sacks she had unstitched at the seams and boiled clean. The backing was dyed a deep blue-brown with black walnut shells. The stitching ran in tight, even rows close enough together that no cold air could move through the layers without first losing all its momentum. She had made 11 quilts like this since September. 2 were on her own bed. The other 9 were folded in the cedar chest by the door. She was not sure yet what she intended to do with them. She heard the knock at 7:30, when the candle had burned down 2 inches and the wind had picked up enough to rattle the window pane. She was not expecting anyone. No one came to her door after dark. No one came much during the day either, unless they needed something mended in a hurry and could not afford to be particular about where the work was done. She set her quilt aside and opened the door. Eli Braxton stood on her porch with his hat in his hands and snow on his shoulders. Eli was 17 and worked at the mill 3 days a week for $1.50 and 2 meals. His mother had died in the spring. His father had gone west looking for silver 2 years before that and had not sent word since. Eli lived in the mill's storage room on a rope cot and tried very hard to pretend this was not a temporary situation. "Miss Hannah," he said, "I'm sorry to bother you." "Then stop being bothered and come inside," Hannah said. "You look like you walked through a field." "I did mostly." He stepped inside, clutching his hat. The mill foreman said, "Well, he said I ought to ask you," though he said it in a way that made it sound like asking was a bad idea. Asking is never a bad idea. It's being refused that hurts. Hannah moved to the stove. "What do you need?" "The nightman cut his hand on the saw blade this afternoon. It's bad enough that Doc Aldridge says he can't work for 2 weeks, and the foreman put me on the night shift to cover, which means I'm sleeping in the yard now because someone else has the storage room and I—" He stopped, swallowed. "I just need to know if you have anything heavier than what I've got. I've got a quilt, but it's thin, and last night I liked to froze and I'd rather not do that again." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. He was thin as kindling and trying very hard to look like he was not ashamed. "Sit down," she said. She put water on for coffee because boys who were almost freezing to death in mill yards needed something warm in their stomachs before they needed anything else. Then she opened the cedar chest and took out one of the 9 quilts. It was pieced from brown and gray wool, with a backing of heavy canvas she had treated with a beeswax finish that kept moisture from seeping through on wet ground. She set it on the table beside him when the coffee was poured. Eli stared at it the way people stared at things they were afraid to want. "Miss Hannah," he said, "I can't pay you for this right now." "I know you can't. I'll get you the money when—" "Eli." She sat across from him. "I didn't make those quilts to sell them. I made them because making quilts is what I do, and I had the materials and the time. You need one. Take it." She paused. "But if you're determined to even the ledger somehow, you can split me a cord of wood before the hard freeze sets in." His face went through 3 or 4 different emotions quickly, and settled on something that looked like gratitude mixed with stubbornness, which was the particular expression of a boy trying not to cry in front of a woman. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can do that." He finished his coffee and left with the quilt under his arm, and Hannah stood in her doorway watching him disappear into the dark. The church hall was still blazing. She went back inside and picked up her needle. The trouble started on a Wednesday. It started specifically with Clara Voss walking into the dry goods store while Hannah was purchasing thread and deciding that a public space required a public lesson. Hannah heard her before she saw her. She was standing at the counter with 3 spools of navy thread and a card of bone buttons when the bell above the door rang and Clara's voice filled the room the way cold air filled a room immediately and without asking permission. "Oh," Clara said. "Hannah Mercer." She said the name the way one might note the presence of a mouse. Hannah turned. She was not going to pretend she hadn't heard. She had learned a long time ago that pretending not to hear was a strategy that worked exactly once, and then it simply trained other people to speak louder. "Clara," she said. Clara was 44, slim as a fence rail, and wore her moral authority the way other women wore good jewelry visibly constantly, and with the clear expectation that others would notice and comment. She had 2 women with her, Ruth Hensley and a younger woman. Hannah didn't recognize who had the wide-eyed look of someone who was still learning the social geography of Coldwater Creek. "I didn't realize you sewed," Clara said, nodding at the thread on the counter. "Most people in town don't bother to find out what I do," Hannah said pleasantly. Something flickered behind Clara's eyes. She had expected Hannah to drop her gaze. Hannah noticed the flicker and did nothing to help her recover. "The Harvest Aid Circle is collecting materials for the county poor box," Clara said, shifting direction. "If you have any extra cloth, we're accepting donations at the church until Friday." "That's generous of you," Hannah said. "We've already collected enough batting for 3 full quilts," Clara continued. She said it with the slight elevation of chin that meant she was about to say something she had been saving. "Of course, the real difficulty is the skilled labor. Not everyone knows how to put a proper quilt together. It takes a certain precision." Her gaze moved from Hannah's face to her hands, to the slow, careful way Hannah was counting buttons, and then back to her face, traveling the long way around. "It's not a task that suits every woman." The younger woman Clara had brought with her made a small sound. Hannah set the buttons down. She looked at Clara the way her mother had taught her to look at people who were trying to reduce her steady direct without heat. "The poor box will be glad of whatever you're able to produce," Hannah said. "I've sent 3 quilts to the County Relief Board already this fall. You might check whether yours will arrive before winter sets in." She picked up her thread and her buttons. "Good day, Clara." She paid for her items and walked out. She made it 2 blocks before her hands started shaking. The man she was about to meet was standing at the hitching post outside the feed store arguing about oats. She would not have noticed him particularly. Coldwater Creek got travelers. Except that he was arguing about oats in a manner so perfectly controlled that it sounded almost quiet, which was its own kind of alarming, because the man he was arguing with was Doyle Fenwick, who had never conducted a conversation in his life without raising his voice. Doyle was currently 4 inches into the personal space of a man who stood a full head taller than him, pointing a finger at what appeared to be a grain sack, and explaining at considerable volume that the price had already been agreed, and he wasn't going to be taken advantage of by some Mr. Fenwick, the tall man said. He said it once. He did not raise his voice. Something about the way he said it made Doyle Fenwick stop mid-sentence. The agreed price was 60 cents a bushel. You've handed me 52 cents worth of grain in a 60-cent sack. If you've made an honest mistake, I'll wait while you correct it. If you haven't made an honest mistake, I'll take my business to Reardon's and tell every rancher between here and the county line why. He was not angry. That was the thing about it. He was simply stating information the way one stated that water ran downhill. Doyle Fenwick turned red, then sputtered, then went back inside to get more grain. The tall man turned, and Hannah found herself looking at him directly, which she had not particularly intended. I was brought across the shoulders in the way of men who actually worked for a living, rather than men who wanted to appear as though they did. Dark eyes. A jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 days. A brown hat with road dust still on his brim. He wore a revolver on his right hip, with the casual practicality of a man who had carried one long enough that he no longer thought about it. He nodded at her, touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said. Hannah nodded back and kept walking. She did not give him another thought until 40 minutes later, when she turned the corner near the church hall and nearly walked into Clara Voss and Doyle Fenwick's wife, who were standing outside the hall's side door in what appeared to be a heated conference. She caught the words before either of them saw her. "Can't have her think she's welcome here, Marta. She just walked in, Clara. I couldn't very well. She's not on the list. The list exists for a reason. She only asked about the fabric donation. I don't care what she asked about. The answer is no." Hannah stopped. They had not seen her yet. She was standing in the shadow of the livery's overhang, holding her parcel of thread, and she thought with sudden clarity that she had two choices. She could walk forward and let them know she'd heard, which would cause a scene that would be reported all over town by morning. Or she could turn around and go home. She was deciding on the latter when Clara Voss turned and saw her. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Hannah," Clara said. Her voice was a perfect practiced neutral. "Clara," Hannah said. "Don't let me interrupt." She walked forward, because going back would have meant going around the block, and she had never in her life walked around the block to avoid Clara Voss, and she was not going to start tonight. She passed within 4 feet of them and kept her eyes forward and her chin level and her hands perfectly still, which cost her something she would not have put a name to. She turned toward home. She heard Clara say something behind her low enough to be almost private and loud enough to be certainly heard. A woman who can't stop herself from eating doesn't need more opportunities to help herself to what belongs to others. Hannah did not stop walking. Her hands were shaking again. Choo. She was on her porch 3 hours later when she heard the commotion from the direction of the Caldwell Inn. She almost didn't go. She had learned over 14 months in Coldwater Creek that public commotions were rarely improved by her presence and were almost always made more complicated by it. But she heard a girl's voice, high and frightened, and that was different. She set down her mending and went. The scene outside the inn involved 4 men who had clearly been drinking since mid-afternoon, a wagon that had been knocked half off its wheels, and a young woman, maybe 20, dark-haired, clutching a carpet bag to her chest, who was backed against the inn's porch railing, while 2 of the men stood between her and the door. "Now come on, sweetheart," one of them was saying. He had a jaw like a shelf, and the particular grin of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. "We're just being friendly." "I asked you to let me pass," the girl said. Her voice was shaking, but her eyes were not. Hannah noticed that with a kind of grim approval. "We heard you." The man grinned wider. "We just don't feel like it." Hannah was about to step forward. She had not entirely worked out what she was going to do, but she had her height and her voice, and enough fury from the last 3 hours that she was willing to improvise, when the tall man from the feed store came out of the inn's front door. He took in the scene in the time it took him to set his coffee down on the porch rail. He stepped off the porch without hurrying. He moved to the girl's side and stood there, not between her and the men exactly, but close enough that the geometry of the situation had changed. "Evening," he said to the man with the shelf jaw. His voice had the same quality it had possessed during the oats argument. Perfectly level, almost quiet. The man's grin dropped a few degrees. "None of your business, friend." "I'm going to need you to step back," the tall man said. And if I don't, then I'll be explaining to the marshal in the morning why I had to make you." The shelf-jawed man looked at the tall man's gun hand, looked at his eyes. Whatever he found in both places made him recalculate something. He stepped back. His companions followed. The girl let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for some time. Hannah reached the edge of the porch just as the men moved away. The tall man turned, and his eyes found her in the small crowd that had gathered, and she realized he had almost certainly been aware of her presence for the last 2 minutes. "Ma'am," he said again. "Just that." "That girl needs somewhere to sit down," Hannah said. "I can see that," he said. "The inn will charge her for the parlor." "I know. There's a bench inside the church, but it's Wednesday and—" "My name is Caleb Dyer," the tall man said. He wasn't interrupting her exactly, more like stepping alongside what she was saying. "I'm the foreman at the Aldrich Ranch 3 miles east. I've got business in town for 2 more days, and you're right that the girl needs somewhere to sit." He paused. "Do you have somewhere to take her?" Hannah looked at the girl who was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had learned to evaluate strangers quickly. "I have coffee and a parlor," Hannah said, "if she wants them." The girl said her name was Pearl. She came inside and sat at Hannah's kitchen table and drank 2 cups of coffee and ate 3 of the sugar cookies Hannah had not managed to deliver to the Harvest Aid Circle, and told Hannah that she was looking for work and had arrived on the afternoon stage and had not expected Coldwater Creek to be quite so cold, quite so fast. Hannah gave her a blanket from the cedar chest and sent her back to the inn with a note to the proprietress who owed Hannah a favor from the previous winter and knew it. Caleb Dyer walked Pearl back to the inn door. When he returned to Hannah's porch, she was standing in the doorway. "Thank you for what you did," she said. He shook his head. She did most of it herself, kept her head. He looked at Hannah with the frank assessing look she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things. Not rude, just direct like a man accustomed to making accurate judgments quickly. "You were coming over there before I came out," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What were you planning to do?" "I hadn't worked that out entirely," Hannah said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one. "Good night, ma'am," he said. He touched his hat and walked back toward the inn. Hannah went inside, sat down at her quilt, and noticed that her hands had stopped shaking. The difficulty with Caleb Dyer was that he came back. She hadn't expected him to. She had assumed the episode outside the inn was its own complete thing, a stranger passing through a useful action, performed a brief and civil exchange, and then nothing further. He appeared at her door on Thursday morning with a question about a fence repair that required in his telling a specific kind of advice that he had been told only 2 people in the county could provide, and one of those people was currently in bed with influenza. He had tracked the other person to her address through the mill foreman, who had apparently mentioned her name in a context he declined to specify. "The fence repair," Hannah said. She was standing in the doorway with her apron on because she had been in the middle of rendering lard. "What's the actual question?" "Aldrich has about 40 yards of stone wall that runs along the creek embankment. It's been shoring up that embankment since 1871. Somewhere in the last 2 years, the mortars started failing, and now every time there's a good rain, we lose another 2 feet of bank. Hydraulic lime," Hannah said. "Standard mortar won't hold near moving water. You need hydraulic lime mixed 2 to 1 with sand, not 3 to 1. And you'll want to point the new joints before you rake them out a ½ inch and clear the old mortar back to solid stone. Otherwise, the new mortar just seals over the failure and falls out again in a year." He looked at her. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "My father built walls," she said. "I handed him mortar from the time I was 9 until he decided I was strong enough to mix it myself. Then I mixed it until I was strong enough to lay it. Then I laid it." She paused. "He said that if you were going to do a thing, you might as well understand why each step of it worked." "Sounds like a practical man," Caleb said. "How was?" Hannah said. And then, because she was not going to stand in the doorway having a conversation while lard sat on the stove. "If you have more questions, you can come in or come back. I'm in the middle of something." He came in. He sat at her kitchen table while she finished the lard, and wrote down the specific ratios for the mortar on the back of an envelope, and he asked 3 more questions, all of them precise and practical, none of them wasted, and she answered them the same way. He looked around her kitchen once, taking in the quilts on the backs of the chairs, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the row of preserved jars on the shelf. Not nosily, just the way someone looked at a thing they were trying to accurately understand and said nothing about any of it. He left at 10:30. She found herself explaining the hydraulic lime process in more detail than was strictly necessary, and realized it was because she hadn't had an actual conversation in 11 days, which was embarrassing enough that she said nothing further and simply handed him the envelope. On Friday, he came back with a bag of apples from the Aldrich orchard, because he said the tree had produced more than they could use, and he'd been looking for someone to take some off his hands. Hannah accepted the apples. She made a pie. She sent half of it back to the Aldrich ranch with the boy who brought the monthly grocery order on Saturday morning, with a note saying, "Thank you for the apples, here are the results." She did not know if he received it. She didn't ask. The confrontation happened on a Sunday. It happened at the general store, which was not closed on Sundays, despite what the Methodist Church thought about the matter, because the Caldwells were Baptist and had a different understanding of commerce and the Sabbath. Hannah had gone in for salt and lamp oil. Clara Voss was there with 4 women from the Harvest Aid Circle, which had apparently decided that the general store was an appropriate place for its monthly coordination meeting, possibly because the Caldwells provided coffee. Hannah took her salt from the shelf and moved to the counter and tried very hard to be invisible, which was an aspiration she had never once successfully achieved in her life. "Hannah Mercer," Clara said from across the room loudly enough that 2 other customers looked up. "I've been meaning to speak to you." "Clara," Hannah said, "that boy from the mill, Eli Braxton, he was telling Marta Fenwick that you gave him one of your quilts." Clara moved toward the counter with the particular efficiency of a woman who had decided this conversation was going to happen on her schedule. "For free." "He needed one," Hannah said. "He's sleeping in the mill yard." "That's very generous," Clara said. "The thing is, Hannah, we've been collecting materials for the county poor box since September. Fabric blankets, finished goods. It would have been more appropriate for you to donate that quilt through the circle. That way, it could have been distributed properly through the proper channels to people who've been assessed as—" "Eli was cold last Tuesday night," Hannah said. "He was standing on my porch and he was cold. I gave him a quilt." "The point," Clara said, "is coordination. If every woman in this county starts giving things away to whomever appears at her door, we'll have chaos. The circle exists to ensure that aid goes where it's actually needed." "I made that quilt myself," Hannah said. She kept her voice even. "Every stitch of it. I bought the batting from my own wages, and I carded it myself, and I cut the pieces, and I set every seam. It belongs to me. I can give it to anyone I choose." "Of course you can," Clara said in the particular tone that meant she was about to remove the word "of course" and replace it with "but." "But the circle." "The circle turned me away," Hannah said. "It landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water." Clara's expression did not change exactly. It contracted slightly the way something contracts when it has been struck. "The frame was full," Clara said. "There were 3 empty chairs," Hannah said. "I counted them through the window. The other women from the circle were watching now. So were both Caldwells and the 2 other customers who had looked up a moment ago and had not looked back down again." Clara's chin came up. "I think," she said, "that perhaps the circle's arrangement is simply not the right fit for everyone. Some women are better suited to—" "To what?" Hannah said. "To working alone. To sitting outside every circle in town and being told their work isn't needed until the moment it is." She set her salt on the counter. "I've made 11 quilts since September, Clara. When the first hard freeze comes, every one of them is going to matter. But I don't expect they'll matter enough to earn me a chair at your frame." She paid for her salt and her lamp oil, and she left. She walked 3 blocks before she heard the footsteps behind her and turned to find Caleb Dyer falling into step beside her. "You were in there," she said. "I was in the back getting a bolt for the well casing." He paused. "I heard most of it." "Then you don't need me to summarize," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. They walked. You told her the truth. For all the good it will do, Hannah said. It might do more than you think, he said. She stopped walking and looked at him. It won't change anything, she said. It never does. Clara Voss has run the social order of this town for 15 years, and she will run it for 15 more, and every woman in that store will go home tonight and tell her husband that Hannah Mercer made a scene, and tomorrow it will be worse than before. She held her parcels against her chest. I know how this works, Mr. Dyer. I've been living it for over a year. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Not through her. At her the way he'd looked at the creek embankment, like a man trying to understand where the true structural failure was. Then why did you say it? He asked. Because it was true, she said. And I'm tired of keeping true things quiet to make other people comfortable. He said nothing for a moment. That's fair, he said finally. He walked her to her door. He did not come in. He touched the brim of his hat, and she said good evening, and he said good evening, and she went inside. She stood with her back against the closed door for a full minute. Then she went to the cedar chest and looked at the quilts still inside it. 8 of them now. 8 quilts full of the warmest batting she knew how to process, stitched in the tightest rows she was capable of producing, backed in canvas, treated against moisture. 8 quilts that could keep a family alive through a hard freeze. 8 quilts that the Harvest Aid Circle had never asked for, and had never acknowledged, and had never wanted right up until the moment they needed them. She was beginning to understand that that moment was coming. The wind outside had turned. She could feel it through the walls. A different quality of cold, coming from a different direction than it had been a week ago. She picked up her needle and kept working. She had 3 more to finish before the first real snow. The snow came on a Monday, not the tentative, half-committed flurries that had been visiting Coldwater Creek since mid-October, drifting down and melting before they could make a decision about staying. This was the real thing, heavy, purposeful, arriving in the night, like a guest who had not announced themselves and intended to be difficult about leaving. Hannah knew before she opened her eyes. She could hear it in the silence, which had a particular density to it, the weight of several inches pressing down on the world outside her walls. She lay still for a moment, calculating. Then she got up, put wood on the fire, and went to the window. The street was buried to the axle hubs of the wagon someone had left outside the Caldwell store. She dressed, made coffee, and sat down at the quilt that was 2 days from finished. By the time the town began to wake up and register what had happened, Hannah had set 140 stitches. The knock came at 8 o'clock. She had expected it to come later, so the earliness of it surprised her, though the fact of it did not. She opened the door. Eli Braxton stood on her porch, and behind him, half hidden by the snow that was still falling, were 2 women she recognized from the mill workers' street. Agnes Poole and her daughter-in-law Cora, who had a 3-month-old baby and a husband currently laid up with a broken collarbone from a fall off the mill loading dock. Miss Hannah, Eli said. He had the quilt she'd given him wrapped over his coat. Cora's baby was up all night. She says the room's cold even with the stove going. And Agnes's chimney's throwing smoke back into the house. Something's wrong with the flue. Hannah looked past him at Cora, who was trying to hold the bundle of blankets and baby together and not let either her arms or her expression give out at the same time. Come in, Hannah said. She brought them all inside, sat Cora by the stove, and unwrapped the baby enough to assess it pale but not blue. Breathing fine, just cold in the particular fretful way of infants who had not slept and were announcing it. She made Cora drink something hot and told Eli to go look at Agnes's chimney flue and tell her what he saw. I don't know anything about chimney flues, Eli said. You have eyes, Hannah said. Look at where the smoke is going and tell me what it's doing. He went. Agnes sat across from Cora and twisted her hands in her lap and said, I'm sorry to come here. I know it's an imposition. It isn't, Hannah said. We didn't know who else. Agnes stopped. Started again. Clara Voss's house is closer, but another stop. I know, Hannah said in a tone that closed that particular door gently but completely. Agnes looked at her with the expression of a woman who had something to say and wasn't sure she was allowed to say it. Then she said it anyway. The circle's not prepared for this. Hannah kept her voice neutral. How do you mean? I mean the blankets they collected for the poor box I helped sort them in October. Half of them are too thin. Some are weight things people didn't want anymore. And the way they're stored in that cold back room at the church. Agnes shook her head. They'll be damp by now. You can't give a family a damp blanket and call it winter relief. Hannah said nothing for a moment. How many families on the Mill Street are in the same position as Cora? She asked. Agnes thought about it. 7 households without proper winter bedding. Maybe more. The Hendersons have a good wood supply, but their blankets are done. The Pollack family just arrived in September. They didn't have time to prepare. Old Mr. Cutler since his wife passed. Hannah nodded slowly. Eli came back in stamping snow from his boots. The flu's got a bird's nest partway up, he said. Starlings from the look of it. Somebody'd need to go up there with a brush. Can you do it? Hannah asked. I've done it before, he said. I'd need a brush. There's one in the barn, second shelf from the top behind the seed bags. She looked at him. When you're done with Agnes's chimney, come back here and I'll send you to the Hendersons and the Pollack family. He stared at her. With what? She nodded toward the cedar chest. He stared at that. Miss Hannah, he said. Those quilts, those took you months. Yes, she said. That's why I made them. By noon she had sent out 4 quilts. By mid-afternoon, she had opened her door 11 times, and 9 of those times involved someone standing on her porch with a problem that ranged from a smoking chimney to a family of 5, sharing one blanket between them. She handled each one the same way, practically without performance, moving from problem to solution, with the focused efficiency of a woman who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment, even if she had not known she was doing so. Word moved through a small town faster than any newspaper, especially in weather that kept people indoors and gave them nothing to do but talk. At 2:30, Caleb Dyer knocked on her door. He was carrying a load of split firewood on his shoulder, like it weighed nothing, which given the size of him, was probably approximately accurate. The ranch sent 2 wagons into town for the week, he said without preamble. Aldrich figured the Mill families would be short on wood. Where do you need it? Hannah looked at the list she had started making on the back of an envelope. Pollack family first. They've got 4 children, and the youngest has a cough. Henderson household second. Then Old Cutler on the far end of the Mill Street. He nodded. You've been keeping track, he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Someone had to, Hannah said. He held her gaze for a moment, something in it that she did not entirely know what to do with. Then he said, I'll take the wood. Send Eli with me to show me the addresses. He started to turn away. Mr. Dyer, she said. He turned back. Clara Voss will hear about this, Hannah said. About the quilts. About people coming here. She'll have something to say about it. Probably, he said. I want you to understand that, Hannah said. Before you park a ranch wagon outside my house and make yourself part of it. He looked at her steadily. Miss Mercer, he said. I've been associated with things I was less proud of than helping a family stay warm. I'll survive the opinion of Clara Voss. Hannah let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. I've got the easy part. He left with Eli and the firewood, and Hannah closed the door and stood in the middle of her parlor and looked at the cedar chest, which now held 3 quilts instead of 8. She picked up her needle and sat back down. She had 2 more to finish. Clara Voss came on Tuesday. Hannah heard the particular rhythm of that knock, composed deliberate, the knock of a woman who intended her arrival to communicate something before she even opened her mouth, and she set down her coffee and opened the door. Clara was wearing her good coat, which meant this was an official visit of some kind. May I come in? Clara asked. Yes, Hannah said, because refusing entry to a woman standing in the snow was not something she was willing to do, regardless of history. Clara came in, looked around the parlor, the way she looked at everything, inventorying, assessing, finding the appropriate category, and sat in the chair Hannah indicated. She held her hands in her lap and did not remove her coat. I've been hearing things, Clara said. People generally do, Hannah said. About the quilts. About you organizing the mill street. Clara's voice was measured. That's what the circle is for, Hannah. The circle turned me away, Hannah said. The frame. There were 3 empty chairs, Hannah said. We've established that. Clara was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her expression that was not quite discomfort and not quite guilt and occupied the uncomfortable space between them. The point is that you're creating a parallel system, she said. If people come to you, they won't come to the circle. If they don't come to the circle can't coordinate properly. And if the circle can't coordinate, then the families on the mill street go cold, Hannah said, which is what was happening before I opened my cedar chest. The circle has resources. Summer weight blankets in a cold back room, Hannah said. Agnes Poole described them to me. Clara's chin came up. Agnes Poole has no business discussing circle inventory with outsiders, she said. The word landed. Hannah heard it, felt the precise weight of it. Outsiders, she said quietly. Clara either heard the shift in her tone or didn't, and pressed forward regardless. The work you've done this week is admirable, truly, but it would be better done through proper channels, with proper coordination, so that decisions about who receives aid are made by the right kind of women, Hannah said. By women who look like you, Hannah said. Not like me. The room went very still. Clara's expression did not crack exactly. It set the way plaster sets when it's about to do something irreversible. That isn't what I said, Clara said. No, Hannah agreed. It's what you mean. It's what you've meant every time you've told me the frame was full, and every time you used the word restraint, and every time you said the circle needed disciplined women. She kept her voice level. She had practiced keeping her voice level since she was 12 years old, and she was very good at it. I have made 14 quilts in 11 weeks, Clara. 14. I have sent every family in need on this street something warm to sleep under, and I have done it without a committee or a budget or a church room or any help from anyone who wasn't 17 years old and working at the mill. She paused. So tell me what exactly it is that you've been coordinating all this time. Clara stood up. I came here to offer an arrangement, she said. The circle will include your quilts in the distribution. My quilts, Hannah said, belong to me. I will continue to give them where they're needed. I don't require the circle's distribution system or its approval. You're being stubborn, Clara said. I've had good practice, Hannah said. Clara moved toward the door. Her hand was on the latch when she stopped. She didn't turn fully, just enough. People will say things, she said, about a woman who positions herself as the town's charity worker. It will look like there are those who will say, you're doing this for attention. The particular cruelty of it was its casualness. Not a shout. A quiet thing slipped sideways into the room. Hannah looked at Clara's back. Let them, she said. The children on the mill street are warm tonight. I can manage the rest. Clara left. Hannah sat back down at her quilt and discovered she had pushed the needle through the wrong layer and had to pull back 8 stitches, which she did without once putting the work down. Caleb found out about the visit through Eli, who had apparently been splitting wood outside and heard more than he was meant to. He came by that evening when the snow had slowed to a suggestion of itself and stood on the porch rather than knocking, which Hannah noticed when she opened the door to check the temperature. She looked at him. How long have you been standing there? She asked. Few minutes, he said. I wasn't sure if you were in the mood for company. What did Eli tell you? That Clara Voss came and said her piece and left unhappy. He paused. And that you didn't back down? No, Hannah said. He nodded. He looked out at the street for a moment. She'll escalate, he said. That's what she does when she doesn't get what she wants. She'll go to the church board, or the merchant association, or whoever will give her the platform. I know, Hannah said. She'll say somethings about the quilts that they're improperly made, or that you obtained the materials questionably, or that you're interfering with established. I know, Hannah said again. He was quiet. Then, what do you want to do? She looked at him. The question caught her slightly off balance, because most people who came to her door this week had not asked what she wanted to do. They had told her what she was doing, or warned her about what was coming, or thanked her in the specific embarrassed way of people who felt they should not have needed help. No one had simply asked. "I want to finish the 2 quilts I have left," she said. "I want to make sure the Pollack children have enough wood for the week. I want to find out if anyone on the far side of town is in the same position as the Mill Street families, because I've been assuming the north end of Coldwater Creek takes care of its own, but I'm not certain that's true." She paused. "And I want to not have this conversation with Clara Voss again, but I've accepted that I probably will." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "The north end doesn't entirely take care of its own," he said. "There are 3 households past the livery that I know of, older families, a widow woman named Sutton, and a man who came out from Ohio in August and hasn't made connections yet." "Do you know them?" "Sutton, I know. The Ohio man I've seen." "Could you take them wood tomorrow?" "Yes," he said. "And I'll find out about the bedding situation." Hannah nodded. They stood in the doorway, in a silence that was not, she realized, uncomfortable. She had grown accustomed to silences that pressed, that accumulated things she was not saying, and things other people were not saying, that had weight and history in them. This was different. It was simply 2 people who were done talking and had not yet moved. "You could come inside," she said. "There's coffee." He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table, the same chair he had occupied during the mortar discussion, and she poured coffee, and they talked for an hour about the specific logistics of a town caught short by the first real winter. Not the emotion of it, not the social politics of it, just the practical reality. Who needed what? Where it was, and where it needed to go. How many households Eli could reach on foot on a given day. Whether the church had any storage space that wasn't occupied by the circle's jurisdiction. She found herself spreading out the envelope she'd been making notes on, then a second envelope when the first ran out of room, and Caleb leaned forward with his coffee cup and pointed at something and said, "The old Mercer building on the south corner. It's been empty since September. The family wintered in Kansas City. I know where the key is. If we needed a dry storage space." "Would they object?" Hannah asked. "I could write and ask," he said. "Or I could write and tell them what we're using it for and let them object if they want to." He looked up from the envelopes. "People generally don't object when what you're doing is keeping their neighbors alive." She looked at him across the table, the notes spread between them, the 2 coffee cups, the lamplight doing what lamplight did in November, and making everything look more settled than it necessarily was, and thought about what it meant that this felt normal. That sitting across a table from this specific man, making specific plans about specific problems, felt like something she had been doing for longer than she had. She looked back down at the notes. "All right," she said. "Write the letter." The letter to the Mercer family took 20 minutes and solved the storage problem by Wednesday afternoon. What happened Wednesday evening solved nothing and created 3 new problems, and was the kind of event that in a small town in the middle of winter had the potential to set the social order on its ear for the next 6 months. It started with Douglas Voss. Clara's son was 26, had his mother's precise sense of social order and his late father's talent for making the assertion of that order look accidental. He had been in Coldwater Creek for 2 weeks, arriving from the county seat where he worked for a land surveyor, and he had apparently decided in that time that Hannah Mercer was a problem that needed addressing. He came to the Caldwell store at the same time Hannah was there, which she was later fairly certain was not an accident. He came with 2 men she didn't know. He stood near the door and said loudly enough to be heard at the back of the store, "Is that the woman who's been going door to door on the Mill Street giving things away?" Hannah did not stop examining the bolt of flannel she'd been considering. "Some people might call it charity," one of the men with him said. "Others might ask where the materials come from." "That's a fair question," Douglas said. "A woman who lives alone, no visible income, suddenly has 8, 9, 10 quilts to hand out, like seed at a fair." 14, Hannah said. Douglas looked over at her. She turned around. 14 quilts, she said. "The batting came from the dry goods store. Caldwell can show you the receipts. The fabric came from my own clothing that I'd worn out my father's old coat and flour sacks I obtained from the mill. The thread is what I purchased in November. Mr. Caldwell has those receipts too. She held his gaze. Is there another question? Something moved across Douglas Voss's face. He had expected something else, she understood. He had expected deflection or embarrassment, or the particular flustered retreat that women were supposed to manage when confronted publicly with accusations about their character. The question, he said, recovering, is whether one woman deciding who gets what is really the best system. It's not a system, Hannah said. It's a response. There are families in this town who went into the first hard snow with insufficient bedding and no one to help them. I had bedding. I helped them. If the circle had been doing its job, I wouldn't have needed to. The circle, Douglas said, and his voice had an edge in it now, is run by women who have dedicated considerable time and— Your mother, Hannah said flatly, told Agnes Poole's daughter-in-law that the circle's blankets were reserved for families who had been properly assessed. Cora has a 3-month-old baby, and her husband has a broken collarbone, and she was in my kitchen at 8 o'clock Monday morning because the baby was too cold to sleep. Your mother's assessment process was not helping that child. The store was very quiet. Douglas Voss took a step forward, and from the back of the store, where he had apparently been looking at hardware for the last 10 minutes and had said nothing whatsoever. Caleb Dyer said, I'd think carefully about that step, Mr. Voss. Douglas stopped. Caleb came forward, unhurried the way he did everything. He stood beside Hannah, not between her and Douglas, just beside her. The difference being that beside was a position of equals and between was a position of guardianship, and apparently he had understood that distinction. Miss Mercer has answered your question, Caleb said. She's answered it with receipts, dates, and names. If you have a substantive objection to the work she's doing, the County Relief Board meets the second Friday of every month. He looked at Douglas the way he had looked at the shelf-jawed man outside the inn. Otherwise, I'd suggest that two men coming into a store to question a woman about her charity work is the kind of story that travels, and not in the direction you'd want it to. Douglas Voss looked at Caleb for a long moment. Then he looked at the other people in the store, Caldwell behind the counter, 2 other women who had stopped pretending to shop a man Hannah didn't recognize near the window. Douglas left. His 2 companions left behind him. The store remained quiet for a few seconds. Then, one of the women. Hannah didn't know very well. Mary Schaefer, the blacksmith's wife, a practical woman who had always been neutral in the way of people who had learned that taking sides in a small town was expensive, said, I have a good wool blanket I was going to donate to the circle. Can I bring it to you instead? Hannah looked at her. Yes, she said. Bring it whenever you like. Outside, the snow had stopped. Hannah walked home with her flannel under her arm and the specific feeling she associated with having said true things in public. Not triumphant, not relieved. Just the quiet exhaustion of having held a position under pressure until the pressure went elsewhere. Caleb walked beside her. You didn't need that, she said after a block. Probably not, he said. I had it handled. You did, he said. I know. She glanced at him. He was looking straight ahead, which meant she could look at his face without him noticing, which she did briefly. There was nothing particularly readable in it. Just the same forward attention he brought to most things. Why did you then? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Because you were right and he was wrong and I was in the store, he said. That's all. That's a very simple answer. It's a simple situation. She thought about pushing further and decided against it. They walked another half block in silence. Thank you, she said. You already thanked me for the wood, he said. I'm thanking you for today, she said. That's different. He nodded. He looked at her sidelong, and she found that she did not look away this time, which was its own piece of information that she filed and did not examine until later. Miss Mercer, he said, I'm going to ask you something and I want you to know that however you answer it doesn't change any of the rest. All right, she said. I'd like to call on you, he said. Not as a neighbor asking about mortar, and not as a ranch foreman delivering wood. I mean formally. As a man who is interested in your company beyond the current situation. She looked at him for a long moment. The cold was significant. The street was empty. The lamp at the corner of the mill road was lit and throwing gold light across the snow that was still perfect and unmarked at this end of the street. "I'll think about it," she said. It was not a yes. It was also not a no, and Caleb Dyer, to his credit, heard both of those things clearly and accepted them both. "Fair enough," he said. He touched his hat at her door and walked back toward the inn. Hannah went inside. She sat down at the quilt that was almost finished and discovered that she had been smiling since the corner of the mill road without being aware of it, which she considered carefully and then decided was information she did not have to do anything about immediately. She pressed the needle through the batting and pulled the thread and set the stitch. She had a lot of work left to do. The crisis. When it announced itself, arrived in the particular form that crises in Coldwater Creek always arrived in through someone else's disaster, becoming everyone's problem before anyone had agreed to share it. It was Friday evening, 8 days after the first snow. Hannah had just finished the last of the 14 quilts. She had sent Eli out that afternoon with the 13th one to a widow named Sutton that Caleb had identified on the north end of town. The 14th she had been holding back, not for any specific recipient yet, just keeping it against the need that always arrived when you thought you'd anticipated everything. She was considering the 14th quilt, running her hand along its surface to check the seam allowances when she heard the bell. Not the church bell, which she knew. This was the fire bell at the mill, which meant something was wrong at the mill, which meant every man in the building and half the town would be moving toward it within 30 seconds. She was at the door in 15. The mill was not on fire. What had happened was worse in some ways and more specific. The loading platform on the north side, the one that had been repaired in October, and repaired improperly, apparently, because the man who should have supervised the work had been sick, and his replacement had made 2 structural decisions that he had not discussed with anyone, had collapsed under the weight of the week's accumulated snow and ice. 4 men had been on it at the time. By the time Hannah arrived, 3 of the 4 had been helped up. The 4th, a man named Garrett, 40 years old with a wife and 2 daughters, was still down lying on the collapsed boards in a position that made Dr. Aldridge, who had arrived just before Hannah, go very still for a moment, before he said something quietly to the man beside him. Hannah pressed through to the front of the gathered people. She took in Garrett's position, his breathing, the angle of his left leg. "He needs to come out of the cold immediately," she said to Dr. Aldridge, "and he needs to be moved flat." Aldridge looked at her. He was a cautious man, methodical, the kind of doctor who believed in doing one thing at a time and doing it correctly. "The leg. I know about the leg," Hannah said. "Moving him flat won't make the leg worse. Leaving him on that collapsed platform in this cold will make everything worse. You need to splint it before you move him, and you need a straight board, and you need a—" "I know how to splint a leg," Aldridge said, but not unkindly. "Then let's get the board," Hannah said. Caleb appeared from somewhere to her left. He had the straight board before she'd finished the sentence, pulled from the mill's lumber stack, the right dimensions, exactly what was needed. He handed it to Aldridge. Aldridge looked at it, then at Hannah, then at Caleb. "Who are you two?" he said, not as an accusation, more as a man trying to organize information quickly. "She knows what she's doing," Caleb said. "Use the board." Aldridge used the board. It took 20 minutes to move Garrett safely to the mill foreman's office, which was the closest warm space. Hannah sent Eli back to her house for the 14th quilt, the one she'd been holding in reserve, the warmest one she'd made, heavy batting canvas backing the one she'd almost kept for herself, because it was the best work she'd ever done. She did not hesitate. She spread it over Garrett while Aldridge finished the splinting, and she told Garrett's wife, who had arrived somewhere in the middle of the moving and was now making the specific sound of a woman holding herself together through pure structural will, that her husband was going to need careful nursing and 3 weeks of stillness, and that the leg had a good chance if it was kept warm and immobile. Garrett's wife looked at Hannah. "Are you a doctor?" she asked. "No," Hannah said. "My father broke the same leg in the same way when I was 15. I learned what worked and what didn't." She squeezed the woman's hand briefly. "He walked fine for 20 years after." That was the moment when Ruth Hensley, who was one of Clara Voss's circle women and had been part of the crowd that gathered, said very quietly to the woman beside her, "She should have been on the relief committee from the beginning." The woman she said it to was Mary Schaefer, The blacksmith's wife, who had brought a wool blanket to Hannah's door on Wednesday morning, and had apparently made a decision at some point between then and now. "Yes," Mary said. Not quietly. Hannah heard both of them. She said nothing. She was still focused on Garrett's leg and the angle of his breathing, and whether the color in his face was improving. It was. She stayed for another hour. When she finally left the mill and walked into the cold night air, Caleb was waiting outside. She was very tired. She was also aware with the specific clarity that sometimes came after an emergency of how much she had been carrying for 14 months. Not just the quilts, not just the work, but the weight of being excluded and dismissed and spoken about and looked past and continuing anyway, because there was no other option that she was willing to choose. "You should sleep," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "Do you need—" "I'm fine," she said. Then, because she was very tired, "I'm not fine. I'm tired and I'm angry, and I've been angry for a year, and some days that's useful, and some days it just costs." Caleb was quiet. "Today it was useful," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "Today it was." She looked up at him. The cold was hard enough that she could see her breath, which meant she was standing close enough to see his. She thought about the question he'd asked her 4 days ago, and the answer she'd given that was not yes and not no. And the fact that she had been carrying that in the back of her mind alongside everything else which told her something. "Ask me again," she said. He looked at her. "About calling on you," he said. "Yes," she said. He studied her face for a moment. Then he said with a carefulness that she recognized as the specific carefulness of a man who had learned to take seriously things that other people treated as simple, "Miss Mercer, may I call on you?" Hannah looked up at him in the cold dark outside the mill. "Yes," she said. "You may." He touched his hat. She walked home alone. The town was quiet around her. Lamps burned in the windows she passed. She thought about Garrett's leg and the 14 quilt, and the look on Ruth Hensley's face when she'd said what she'd said. She also thought about the particular word Caleb had used, formally. He had said formally. She was nearly at her door before she let herself fully consider what that meant. Not just calling on her, not friendship or assistance, or the pleasant accident of proximity during an emergency. Formally, with intent. She pushed open her door and went inside and built up the fire, and sat in the chair she always sat in and did not pick up her needle. She just sat. For the first time in a very long time, she had nothing left to finish tonight. She let the fire warm her and thought about the spring. Caleb came calling on a Sunday, which was the only day the ranch work slowed enough to allow it. He did not bring flowers because it was December, and flowers were not a feature of Kansas in December. He brought a pound of good coffee and a jar of blackstrap molasses from the Aldrich stores, and he set them on Hannah's kitchen table with the straightforward practicality of a man who had thought about what would actually be useful rather than what would look appropriate. Hannah looked at the coffee and the molasses. "You could have brought nothing," she said. "Calling on someone doesn't require tribute." "I know," he said. "I wanted to bring something useful. I thought about it for 2 days." She looked at him. He was serious. He had apparently genuinely thought about it for 2 days. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." They spent 2 hours at her kitchen table, and Hannah later could not have said precisely what they talked about. Only that the conversation moved through 6 territories: his years on the cattle trail, her father's wall building, the specific injustice of a county relief system that required recipients to prove need before the need was actually addressed. The question of whether the Pollack family would manage their first full Kansas winter or retreat east come spring, and none of it felt like the effortful talk of people who were trying to demonstrate something to each other. It felt like two people who already knew how to talk to each other, discovering that they had known this for longer than they realized. When he left at 4:30, Hannah stood in the doorway and watched him walk back toward the inn and thought about the particular quality of his attention, the way he had listened. Not with the performance of listening, but with the actual thing tracking what she said and responding to what she meant, rather than what she'd merely stated. She had not experienced that with many people. She went back inside and sat down at her quilt frame and found herself thinking about spring again, the way she had the night of the mill accident. Not a specific plan, just a direction. It was the closest thing to hope she had permitted herself in some time. The Harvest Aid Circle met on the second Tuesday of December, and Hannah was not invited. She had not expected to be. What she had not anticipated was that 3 women who were on the Circle's official membership list would send word to her door before the meeting, asking if they could come by afterward. Ruth Hensley came first at 7:30, with her coat still on, and a dish of apple cake she had apparently made specifically for this purpose. "I owe you an apology," Ruth said, sitting at Hannah's table, with her hands flat on her thighs, the way a person sat when they were making themselves stay still through discomfort. "Not just for the Mill Street, and not just for tonight, for the last 14 months. Hannah set a plate for the cake, and did not say anything yet. "I knew the frame wasn't full that first night," Ruth said. "I was sitting at it. There were 3 chairs open. Clara said to say it was full, and I said it. To your face." She stopped. Her jaw worked. "I've thought about that many times since." "Why are you telling me this now?" Hannah asked. Not cruelly. Genuinely. Ruth looked at her. "Because I watched you save Walter Garrett's leg on Friday night, and then I watched Clara spend the Circle meeting tonight, explaining why the relief committee should have been the one to respond to the mill accident, and I couldn't sit in that room anymore and say nothing." Hannah was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you saying it," she said finally. "I won't pretend it didn't matter. What happened at that door mattered considerably." "I know," Ruth said, "but I'm not going to tell you it's forgiven and done and forgotten, because that wouldn't be honest, and you didn't come here for dishonest comfort." Ruth nodded. Her hands were still flat on her thighs. "What did I come here for then?" "To start somewhere different from where you've been," Hannah said. "That's what an apology is for. Not to erase the thing. To decide to do something else from here." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "You're a harder woman than people give you credit for," she said. "No," Hannah said. "I'm an honest one. People confuse the two." Mary Schaefer came an hour later with nothing but herself and a direct manner that Hannah had come to appreciate. She sat down and said, "The Circle voted tonight to offer you associate membership, which is their way of saying you can contribute quilts to the poor box through their distribution system, while Clara retains final say over where they go." Hannah looked at her. "That's their offer," she said. "That's their offer," Mary confirmed. "I voted against it. Not because I don't think you should be in the Circle, but because I think the offer is insulting, and I said so in the meeting, which is why Clara and I are not currently on speaking terms." "What did Clara say when you said it was insulting?" "She said I didn't understand the administrative necessity of maintaining clear organizational hierarchy." Mary paused. "I told her that the administrative hierarchy had left Cora's baby cold on a Monday morning, and I wasn't certain it had the standing to be particular about its own dignity." Hannah looked at Mary Schaefer, practical, direct, utterly without performance, and felt a warmth toward her that was different from gratitude and more durable. "What do you think I should do?" Hannah asked. "I think you should say no," Mary said. "And I think you should let me and Ruth and Agnes work on the rest of the Circle from the inside. And I think that by February, there will be a different conversation available to you." She paused. "Clara's position is weaker than she knows. She's been the authority here for 15 years, and authority that's never been challenged often doesn't know what it's made of until someone pushes. She'll make things difficult," Hannah said. "She already is," Mary said. "The difference is that now she's making things difficult for you with witnesses." Hannah turned that over. "All right," she said. "Tell them no." Mary nodded. She stood to go, then stopped. "The apple cake Ruth brought, was it the kind with the cinnamon in the batter, or the kind with the cinnamon on top?" "In the batter," Hannah said. "Hers is better than mine," Mary said with the rueful honesty of someone who had accepted this fact. "Don't tell her I said that." She left, and Hannah sat alone with the apple cake and the coffee, and the particular sensation of having allies for the first time in 14 months, which felt simultaneously like relief and like something she was afraid to examine too closely, in case it turned out to be temporary. It was not temporary. But it was also not simple, because nothing in Coldwater Creek that involved Clara Voss was ever simple, and Clara having lost the Circle vote, and the subsequent argument with Mary Schaefer moved her efforts to a different territory. She went to Reverend Aldrich. Hannah heard about this from Eli, who had begun operating as an extremely effective intelligence network without anyone formally appointing him to the position, largely because he was 17 and moved around the town invisibly, and people said things in front of him that they would not have said in front of an adult. She told him, "You're running an unofficial charity operation without church sanction." Eli reported sitting at Hannah's kitchen table with his third cup of coffee and the particular satisfaction of a boy who was useful and knew it. And that it creates confusion about where people should bring their needs. "What did Reverend Aldrich say?" Hannah asked. "He said he'd look into it," Eli said. Then after she left, he told the deacon that the woman who'd splinted Walter Garrett's leg probably didn't need his sanction to keep warm a family that was cold. Hannah let out a breath. "He said that," she said. "Near enough," Eli said. "The deacon told the miller, and the miller told my foreman, so it's possible some of the specific wording changed along the way." "That's how most information travels in this town," Hannah said. "Yes, ma'am," Eli said without irony, and finished his coffee. What Eli didn't report, because he didn't know it yet, was what Clara did next. Hannah found out on Thursday morning when she went to the dry goods store for lamp oil, and Caldwell, steady, reliable Caldwell, who had always treated her with the uncomplicated decency of a man who cared about business and not social hierarchies, looked at her from behind the counter with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "Hannah," he said, "I need to tell you something." He told her. Clara Voss had been to see him the previous afternoon, and she had suggested, not quite demanded, Clara never quite demanded, she suggested in the way that contained an unmistakable current beneath the surface, that extending credit to Hannah Mercer was a social risk for a business that depended on community goodwill. She had mentioned in passing that several Circle members did their substantial shopping at the store, and that the social climate a delicate thing. Caldwell was watching Hannah's face as he said this. She did not let what she was feeling reach her face. She had 14 months of practice. "I see," she said. "I told her," Caldwell said carefully, "that I ran my business on the basis of a customer's account history, and not on the basis of other customers' opinions, and that Miss Mercer's account history was impeccable." Hannah looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "I also told her," Caldwell said, with the specific deliberateness of a man making sure all the information was conveyed, that if she preferred to shop somewhere that operated on different principles, Reardon's was open 6 days a week. Something in Hannah's chest unclenched slightly. "How did she receive that?" Hannah asked. "She left without purchasing the fabric she came in for," Caldwell said. "I consider that informative." Hannah bought her lamp oil and walked home and sat at her quilting frame and thought about what Clara had done. Not the attempt to cut off her credit, that was a tactic unpleasant but manageable. What she was thinking about was the shape of what Clara was doing. Cutting off credit, approaching the church, offering the insulting associate membership. All of it moving from the same direction, trying to reduce Hannah's ability to operate independently. Trying to make her either dependent on the Circle's structure or simply less capable of functioning in the town. It was the behavior of a woman who was afraid. Hannah had not thought about it in those terms before. She had thought about it in terms of cruelty or prejudice, or the deep particular meanness of a person who had spent 15 years at the top of a social order and could not tolerate anyone who existed outside it. All of those things were true, but underneath all of them was fear. Clara Voss was afraid of what Hannah Mercer's existence meant, the evidence it provided, that a woman could be large and capable, and needed and respected, and that the Circle's careful management of who qualified for community belonging was therefore not a necessary function of social order, but simply a preference of those who held power. Hannah sat with that for a while. Then she picked up her needle. She had 3 quilts started and no more batting, and she needed to order more from the county supply. And if Clara Voss continued in this direction, there might come a point where Coldwater Creek would have to decide which of them it actually needed. Hannah was willing to let that question be asked. She was not willing to lose. Caleb came on Sunday again, which was becoming the shape of things between them. He came with coffee. He had apparently decided that coffee was both useful and a reasonable symbol of his intentions, and Hannah had decided not to object to this, and they sat at her table, and this time, the conversation moved differently than it had before. It moved toward the personal. She had been watching him for 3 weeks now. The careful way he did things, the economy of it, the way he never performed competence, but simply exercised it. She had been watching him with Eli, the straightforward respect he extended to a 17-year-old boy, treating his observations as worth hearing, never making him feel small. She had been watching the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, which was a look she had some experience receiving from men, and which in most cases she had learned to deflect early, because it meant something that was going to become a problem. This was different. She could not entirely have said why, only that it was. "What happened to you on the trail?" she asked. "The thing that made you leave." He looked at her. She had not asked a personal question before. He registered the shift. "What did you hear?" he asked. "Nothing specific," she said. "Only that you were on the trail for 9 years and you left and you haven't gone back." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. This was the only time she ever saw him do something without a clear purpose. Turn things in his hands when he was thinking something he hadn't decided whether to say. "I had a partner," he said. "Man named Thomas. We'd ridden together 3 drives, maybe 4. He was a good man, steady." He stopped. On the last drive, about 3 weeks out from Abilene, he started showing signs. Heat, confusion. The trail boss said he was drunk. Hannah was very still. "I wasn't drunk," Caleb said. "No," Hannah said quietly. "He died 3 days later." Caleb looked at the table. "I knew what was happening. I'd seen it before a man my father worked with years back. I told the trail boss. He said I was young and I didn't know what I was talking about and Thomas needed to walk it off." His jaw tightened. "I should have stopped the drive. I didn't know if I had the authority. I told myself I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "You did know," Hannah said. "Yes," he said. "That's the part that doesn't leave." She thought about what to say and decided to say the true thing. "You were wrong not to push harder, and you've been carrying that as a reason to push too hard ever since, to make every decision before someone else can fail to make it." He looked at her. "Is that what you see?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You're protective the way a man is protective when he's afraid of what happens if he isn't. That's different from being protective, because you believe the person needs protecting." He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd gone too far. "You're right," he said. She had not expected him to say it that quickly. "Most people argue when you tell them something uncomfortable about themselves," she said. "I've been arguing with myself about it for 9 years," he said. "I'm tired of the argument." He looked at her directly. Does that change something for you, knowing that?" She considered it honestly. "No," she said. "It explains some things. It doesn't change them." "All right," he said. They finished the coffee. When he left, he held her hand at the door, not dramatically, just the way a man held a woman's hand when he was saying something he didn't have the words for yet. His hand was very warm. She thought about that after the door was closed, standing in the middle of her parlor, with her quilt on the frame and the lamp burning and the December wind at the window. She was falling in love with Caleb Dyer. She registered this, the way she registered most information that required careful handling clearly, without panic, with the specific attention it deserved. She set it down in her mind where she could look at it squarely. It was terrifying. It was also somehow the most solid thing she had felt in a long time. She picked up her needle and tried to concentrate on the quilt, and managed it only imperfectly, which she considered acceptable under the circumstances. The storm came on the 20th of December, and it came the way the serious ones always came, without adequate warning, building through the night from something manageable into something else entirely, so that the town woke up the next morning to conditions that bore almost no resemblance to the previous evening's assessment. Hannah was awake before dawn. She had heard the wind change at 2 in the morning, not the direction exactly, but the quality of it, the drop in temperature that came through even the good insulation she'd packed around her windows. She got up, built the fire as high as she dared, checked the wood supply on the porch, and started making calculations. By the time the gray light came in through the window, she had a list. The Pollack family was her first concern. They had wood. Caleb had made sure of that, but their cabin had poor insulation and 4 children, and Marta Pollack had gone 3 days past her expected time with the new baby, and Dr. Aldridge had been by twice already that week. The second concern was old Cutler on the north end, who lived alone, and whose habit of stubborn independence had, in Hannah's assessment, crossed the line from admirable into dangerous when the temperature dropped below 10 degrees. The third concern was the mill workers in the yard. Eli's situation had been improved since November, but there were 3 other boys doing shift work who were sleeping in configurations she did not consider adequate for a blizzard. She was at the door with her coat on when the knock came. It was Eli, which did not surprise her. What surprised her was that he had already been to the Pollack house. "Marta's in labor," he said. "The baby's coming now. Aldridge is on the other side of town. Mrs. Hennessy's husband had a bad night with his heart. I went by his house first." Hannah thought for approximately 3 seconds. "Go get Mary Schaefer," she said. "Tell her to bring the kit she keeps for difficult births. She'll know what you mean. Then go to the mill and tell the foreman those boys need to be inside today, not in the yard. All of them." "What are you going to do?" Eli asked. "I'm going to the Pollacks," she said. She had assisted at 2 births in her life, her cousin's daughter in Ohio 8 years ago, and a woman on the road between towns when she was traveling with her father, and there had been no one else. She was not a midwife. She was not trained in any formal sense. What she was present and calm and in possession of specific knowledge about what could go wrong and what to do about it. She arrived at the Pollack cabin to find Joseph Pollack standing outside in the snow, looking at his hands, which was the posture of a man whose wife was in labor and who had absolutely nowhere useful to put himself. "Joseph," she said, "go inside. I need hot water and clean cloth, and you to keep the older children in the far room." He looked at her with the expression of a man who would have agreed to almost anything to be given a task. "Yes," he said. "Yes, all right." Marta was in a bad way, not dangerous yet, but moving toward it faster than Hannah liked. The baby had been in the wrong position for 3 days and hadn't corrected, and Marta was exhausted in the specific way of a woman who had been fighting a long battle against a body that wasn't cooperating. Hannah talked to her the whole time. Not reassurances exactly. She had always disliked false comfort, and she suspected Marta, who was a practical woman from a farming family, disliked it too. Instead, she told Marta what was happening and what they were going to do about it, step by step, in the plain, steady voice she used for explaining things that mattered. Mary Schaefer arrived 20 minutes later and took in the situation with one long professional look. "You've done this before," Mary said. "Twice," Hannah said. "You?" 7 times, Mary said, and rolled up her sleeves. They worked together without wasting words on anything that wasn't necessary. Hannah held Marta through the worst of it, and Mary managed the technical complications, and Joseph kept the fire going from the other room, and the 4 older Pollack children ages 2 through 8 sat in a remarkably disciplined row on the far bed, and said almost nothing, because children on the frontier learned early that the adults being very quiet and very focused meant you made yourself small and still. The baby came at noon. A girl. Loud, immediate, indignant in the way of all healthy newborns. Marta made a sound that had nothing complicated in it at all. Just pure relief. The sound of a woman arriving at the end of something very hard. Hannah wrapped the baby and put her in Marta's arms and sat back on her heels and let out the breath she had been rationing for the last 4 hours. Mary looked at her across Marta. "You're good at this," Mary said. "I'm good at staying calm," Hannah said. "That's most of it." "That's all of it," Mary said. "Most people can't manage it." She walked home through the storm at 2 in the afternoon, and the storm was bad enough that she had to stop twice and wait for the wind to drop below the level that made forward movement essentially theoretical. She was not afraid. She was cold and tired, and the particular kind of empty that came after sustained useful action, the feeling of having run at full capacity for hours and having nothing left in reserve. She was half a block from her house when she saw Caleb, who was coming from the direction of the inn, moving through the snow with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had been looking for something for a while and had found it. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped. They looked at each other through the blowing snow. "Eli told me," he said, "where you went. I wanted to make sure—" He stopped. He was not. She realized a man who was used to not knowing how to finish a sentence. "Are you all right?" "Baby Pollack is healthy and named," Hannah said. "Marta is exhausted but safe. I am cold and tired and would very much like to go inside." He fell into step beside her without another word. At her door she unlocked it and pushed it open and went inside, and she was already building up the fire before she registered that he had come in behind her and was shaking the snow from his hat in her entryway. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I didn't invite you in," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll go if you want me to." She turned back to the fire. "Make coffee," she said. He made coffee. She sat in her chair and let the warmth from the fire come back into her hands and her feet, and he set a cup beside her and took the chair across the fire from her. The chair that had started being his chair in her mind sometime in the last 2 weeks without her consciously assigning it. She drank the coffee. "The storm is going to be bad," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been checking on the families on the north end. Old Cutler is with the Aldriches. His neighbor went and got him this morning. The mill boys are inside." He paused. "You already handled most of it before I got here." "Eli handled most of it," she said. "Because you trained him to." She looked at the fire. "Caleb," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to ask you something and I want you to think before you answer." She heard him sit forward slightly. "All right," he said. "When this is over," she said. "When the winter is done and the circle has had whatever reckoning it's going to have, and Coldwater Creek has gone back to whatever it is. Normally, what does this look like?" She gestured between them vaguely because she was too tired to be more precise. "What are you thinking?" He was quiet. She waited. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I've met one person in my life who I'm not afraid to tell hard things to, and who tells hard things to me, and who doesn't flinch when the situation requires something difficult." He looked at her directly. "I'm thinking I'd like to not lose that when the winter ends." "That's not an answer," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm working up to one." He set his coffee cup down on the floor beside the chair. "I want to marry you. That's the answer. I want to marry you, and I want to do it in a way that makes sense to you, and not just to me, which means I'm not going to ask you right now, when you've just spent 4 hours delivering a baby in a blizzard, and you're too tired to argue with me properly." Hannah looked at him. Something shifted in her chest, not a small thing. "You're waiting to ask me until I have enough energy to argue with you," she said. "I'm waiting to ask you until you have enough energy to say yes for reasons you can defend in the morning," he said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a long moment. "That," she said, "is the most sensible thing anyone has ever said to me." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had not been able to categorize when she saw it through the blowing snow. Not quite a smile, not simply relief. Something that looked, she thought, like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had been given permission to set it down. "Sleep," he said. "I'll keep the fire." She wanted to object on principle. She was too tired. She fell asleep in the chair with her coffee half finished, and the storm pressing at the walls, and Caleb Dyer sitting across the fire. And she did not hear him leave in the evening, only the sound of the door settling quietly behind him, sometime in the dark. The storm lasted 3 days. By the end of the second day, it had become the kind of event that a town discussed for 20 years afterward, measuring other winters against it. The snow came in at angles, the temperature dropped to the lowest reading anyone could remember, and the wood supplies that had seemed adequate at the beginning of December began to feel precarious by the morning of the 22nd. Hannah managed all of it, not alone. That was the important thing. The thing that the town would discuss, along with the snow totals and the temperature records. She managed it in coordination with Mary Schaefer and Ruth Hensley, and Eli and Caleb, and the mill foreman, who had turned out to be a practical man underneath his bluster, and Dr. Aldridge, who had gotten to Mrs. Hennessy's husband in time, and returned to find the town running on a system of organized distribution that had appeared, as far as he could tell, fully formed from several people making the same decisions in parallel. The circle's response, meanwhile, was a committee meeting. Clara Voss called it on the evening of the first day, and it lasted 3 hours, and at the end of it, they had produced a plan for distribution that would have been perfectly adequate in conditions approximately 30% less severe than the ones currently occurring. Mary came by Hannah's house after the meeting cold and sharp-eyed. "She knows," Mary said without preamble. "She knows the town is already running on your system and not hers. She's not going to say it out loud, but she knows." "What is she going to do about it?" Hannah asked. That, Mary said, is the question. The answer came on the morning of the third day. Hannah was at the church. The church hall had been opened as a warming space for families whose own heat had become unreliable, and she and Eli and 2 other women had been running the distribution of food and wood from there since the previous afternoon when Clara Voss walked in. Not to help, to audit. She came with her account book and her particular expression of organizational authority, and she walked through the hall taking stock of everything who was there, what they had received, what the distribution looked like, where the supplies had come from. She said nothing directly to Hannah. She spoke to the families asking them how they had come to be there, how they had heard about the distribution point, whether they had registered with the Circle's established relief list. Most of the families answered her questions patiently because they were cold and tired, and they understood that Clara Voss was a social power in this town, even when they were sitting in a warming hall that she had not organized and eating food that she had not provided. Then she reached Joseph Paulak. Joseph, who was a quiet man, a working man, a man who had come from Poland 6 years ago and spent those years trying to understand the rules of his new country and comply with all of them. Joseph looked at Clara Voss and her account book and said very calmly in the particular accented English of a man who had learned the language as an adult and chose each word deliberately. "My wife had our daughter 3 days ago in a blizzard. She had no doctor. She had Hannah Mercer. My daughter is alive because of Hannah Mercer." He paused. "You have a book." Clara held the book. "I have nothing for your book," Joseph said. "I have my daughter." The hall was quiet. Hannah from across the room met Joseph's eyes. He nodded at her briefly, the nod of a man who had said what needed saying and was content with it. Clara closed the account book. She stood in the middle of the hall for a moment, and Hannah watched her with the attention she brought to things she was trying to accurately understand. Not cruelty, she was not interested in Clara's humiliation. Understanding. What she saw was a woman who had built her identity around managing a town's sense of who deserved care, and who was standing in a room full of evidence that the town had found its own way to that care, and the evidence was everywhere she looked, and it had nothing to do with her. Clara turned and walked toward the door. She stopped when she was level with Hannah. She did not look at her. Her gaze was forward. "The quilts at the poor box," Clara said quietly enough that only Hannah could hear. "The ones that came in anonymous last week. Those were yours." It was not a question. "Yes," Hannah said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "They were the warmest ones we had," she said. She walked out. The door closed behind her. Hannah stood looking at the door for a long moment. Then she turned back to the distribution table where Eli was trying to manage 3 families at once and starting to look slightly overwhelmed, and she went back to work. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease. She could hear it in the wind, the particular quality of a thing that had been fighting hard and was running out of the energy to continue. The temperature was still brutal, but there was something different in the pressure of it, a hint of what would eventually become thaw. Not yet, but coming. Hannah handed a blanket across the table to a woman who took it with both hands and held it against her chest, like something she intended to keep. Then she reached for the next one and kept working, because there were still hours left in the day, and people still coming in from the cold, and whatever was coming in the days after this storm, whatever Clara Voss was going to say or do, whatever the circle was going to become, whatever Caleb was going to ask her when she had enough energy to answer properly, all of that could wait. The work was in front of her. She did it. The storm broke on a Thursday. Not gently. The way hard things in Kansas broke all at once, the wind dropping inside an hour. The sky going from the flat white of a blizzard to a cold blue so clear, it looked like something that had never heard of snow. The temperature did not rise, but the fighting stopped, and that was its own kind of mercy. Hannah stood in the doorway of the church hall and felt the stillness and thought, now comes the harder part. The harder part was what always came after a disaster in a small town. Not the disaster itself. People were usually surprisingly capable during the disaster, held together by the simple necessity of survival. The harder part was the morning after, when the necessity lifted, and everyone had to decide what to tell themselves about what had happened and who had done what and what it meant. She pulled her coat tight and went back inside. There were still 14 families in the hall. Some of them would be able to go home today. Some would need another day before their houses were safe to return to. She had a list, and she worked through it methodically, because methodical was what the situation required. And Hannah Mercer had been doing the thing a situation required since she was 12 years old. Eli appeared at her elbow at 9 o'clock with a cup of coffee and the information that Walter Garrett had sent word from home. He had managed to stand for the first time since the accident, briefly with his wife and daughter on either side, and the leg had held. Hannah took the coffee and didn't say anything for a moment. "Good," she said finally. "That's good." "His wife wants to come by," Eli said, "to thank you." "She doesn't need to do that." "She knows she doesn't need to," Eli said. "She wants to." Hannah looked at him. He was developed. She noticed the particular quality of a person who had learned the difference between what was necessary and what was right, and was starting to apply that understanding to practical situations. She considered this to be one of the more useful things she had managed in the last month. "All right," she said. "Tell her any afternoon." He went. She drank her coffee and turned back to the list. Caleb came at noon. He came with the ranch wagon, which he had loaded with enough split wood to restock the church hall's supply, and then some. He and two of the Aldrich hands unloaded it in 40 minutes, while Hannah managed the families still inside, and then the hands went back to the ranch, and Caleb came in and found her at the distribution table, writing in the margins of an already heavily annotated envelope. He sat down across from her without being invited, because by this point, the performance of waiting to be invited was a formality that neither of them was maintaining. "How bad is the north end?" she asked without looking up. "Cutler's roof held," he said. "The Hendersons lost a window, but they've got it boarded. The family passed the livery, the ones from Ohio, they're fine. Better prepared than I expected." "People are often better prepared than expected when they've had a reason to prepare," Hannah said. "Yes," he said. He watched her write for a moment. "Hannah." She looked up. "The circle met this morning," he said. "Early. Before the families in here were awake." She set down her pencil. "Who told you?" "Mary Schaefer sent word to the ranch." He paused. "Clara called the meeting. She proposed dissolving the current relief committee structure and rebuilding it." Hannah was very still. "What does that mean exactly?" she said. "Mary says it means Clara knows the current structure doesn't work, and she'd rather dissolve it herself than have it dissolve around her." Caleb looked at her steadily. "She's proposing a new committee. Open membership, no invitation list, resources pooled and distributed by need rather than by whether Clara Voss approves of your figure," Hannah said. "Those weren't the exact words used," Caleb said. "No," Hannah said. "They wouldn't be." She looked at the envelope in her hand. The list of families, the notes she had been making for 3 days about who needed what and where it was and how it should move. 3 days of work that the Circle's 15-year system had not been able to produce in 15 years. "Is it real?" she asked. "Or is it a restructuring that looks different and functions the same?" "That," Caleb said, "depends on what you do with it." She looked at him. "Mary thinks," he said carefully, "that if you decline to participate, the new structure becomes Clara's structure with a different name. And if you join it, it becomes something the town built together, and Clara has to live inside it like everyone else." Hannah was quiet for a long moment. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think," he said, "that you've been doing the work without the structure for 3 months. The structure without you is just furniture." He paused. "But I'm not the one who gets to decide what you do with an organization that spent 14 months excluding you." She appreciated that he understood this. She appreciated it considerably. "I need to think," she said. "I know," he said. "There's no meeting until Saturday." He stood to go. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. She looked at him across the distribution table, with the list between them and the families still behind her, and the wood he had just stacked by the wall. She thought about what he had said 3 days ago in her parlor with the storm at the walls. "I want to marry you. I'm not going to ask you right now." She thought about the fact that she had fallen asleep in the chair and woken up to the fire still burning, and him gone, which meant he had stayed long enough to keep the fire, and then left without waking her, and she had been carrying that specific fact in her chest since Thursday morning, like something she hadn't found the right place to set down yet. "You said you'd ask me when I had enough energy to argue with you properly," she said. He was very still. "I have enough energy," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "There are 14 families behind you," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to ask me now. I'm telling you I'm ready when you do." Something moved across his face that was not the careful, controlled expression he usually presented to the world. Something more unguarded than that. "All right," he said quietly. He touched the brim of his hat and walked out. Hannah turned back to her list and discovered she had been holding her breath, which she let out slowly, and then she went back to work, because 14 families were still behind her, and they still needed things, and the fact that her heart was conducting itself in an entirely undignified manner at the moment was not information she was going to let interfere with the distribution schedule. Ruth Hensley came by the hall that afternoon with soup, a full pot of it, venison and root vegetables enough to feed 20 people, and she carried it in herself and set it on the table without announcing it, and began ladling it out to the children first, because Ruth had raised 4 children and knew which people in a room needed to eat before they could manage anything else. Hannah watched her for a moment. Then she picked up a ladle and worked beside her. They didn't speak for 20 minutes. They didn't need to. The work organized itself the way the work always organized itself, when 2 competent people were doing it in the same space with the same goal. When the soup was down to the bottom of the pot, and the children had been fed, and most of the adults had eaten, and the hall had the slightly warmer quality of a room full of people who were no longer hungry. Ruth washed the pot and said quietly, without looking at Hannah directly, "I spoke to Clara this morning." "About the committee," Hannah said. "About you." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I told her that if the new committee didn't have Hannah Mercer in it, I would not be in it either, and that Agnes felt the same, and Mary felt the same, and that she should be aware that the 3 of us represented about 40% of the functioning labor of the circle at any given time, and that she could do the arithmetic herself." Hannah looked at her. "What did Clara say?" she asked. Ruth's expression was complicated. Not quite satisfaction, not quite grief. Something that occupied the difficult space between winning a thing and the cost of winning it. "She said she would consider the full composition of the new committee," Ruth said. And then she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, Ruth stopped, cleared her throat. She said, "I have not behaved well." The hall was very quiet. Hannah set down her ladle. "She said that," she said. "Yes," Ruth said. "Those exact words. I have not behaved well." Ruth looked at Hannah directly now. "I've known Clara Voss for 19 years. I have never once heard her say anything approaching that." Hannah thought about Clara in the doorway of the hall, the morning of the 3rd storm day, saying they were the warmest ones we had, in the tone of a woman confessing something she hadn't intended to confess. "It's not enough," Hannah said. "Not yet. Words aren't enough." "No," Ruth agreed. "But it's a start that I didn't think we'd get to." Hannah picked up her ladle again. "Saturday's meeting," she said. "I'll be there." Ruth nodded. She took her soup pot and her coat and left, and Hannah stayed until the last family had somewhere to go, and then she locked the hall and walked home in the late afternoon cold, with the particular feeling of a woman who has been running at full speed for 3 days and is now for the first time beginning to see the shape of what comes next. Friday was the day Douglas Voss made his last attempt. She had not thought about Douglas since the confrontation at the general store. She had been in the intervening weeks simply too busy to give him the attention he apparently required. This turned out to have been a strategic error, because Douglas Voss, unattended, had been marinating in his grievance and had arrived at a plan. He went to the county land office. The claim was technical. Hannah's house sat on land that had been part of a disputed lot sale in 1882, and the original deed had a surveying error that the county had been meaning to correct for 3 years and had not. Douglas had apparently spent some time with the records, and he brought this information to the county clerk with the specific suggestion that if the deed were corrected properly, it would place the eastern boundary of the lot 4 feet inside the wall of Hannah's house, which would technically make her residence a structure on county land, which would require her to either purchase the additional footage or vacate. It was the kind of attack that was perfectly legal and perfectly vicious. Hannah found out about it from Caldwell on Friday morning, who had found out from the county clerk's assistant, who had found out from the clerk himself, who had apparently found the whole business distasteful enough to mention it to someone. She read the note Caldwell sent. She sat at her kitchen table for 5 full minutes, doing nothing but thinking. Then she put on her coat and went to find Caleb. She found him at the ranch, which was 3 miles east of town, which she covered in the Pollack wagon that Joseph had offered her without being asked. She pulled up to the ranch house, and Caleb came out to meet her with the expression of a man who could read the set of her shoulders from 20 yards. "What happened?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment that had a particular texture to it, not explosive, but the specific stillness of a man who is choosing not to be explosive. "Do you have the deed?" he said. "In the house," she said. "I haven't looked at it in 2 years." "Get it," he said, "and then come back here. The Aldriches have a lawyer who works the county circuit. He was here in October for the land transfer, and he's coming back in January." But Silas Aldrich himself has read more property deeds than most lawyers in this state because he's been arguing boundary disputes for 30 years. He was already moving. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "This is my problem," she said. He looked at her. "I know," he said. "That doesn't mean you have to solve it with no one beside you." She held that for a moment. "All right," she said. She got the deed. Silas Aldrich, who was 63 years old and had the particular weathered authority of a man who had spent 6 decades being right about things and could prove it, read the deed in 15 minutes, and the county survey records that Caleb had already sent a hand to retrieve in another 20. "The surveying error is real," Silas said. "Douglas Voss found a real thing." Hannah's stomach tightened. "However," Silas said with the specific emphasis of a man who has been waiting to deploy that word, "the 1882 lot sale included a recorded boundary agreement between the original owner and the county, which supersedes the survey error. It's in the attachment on the 3rd page." He set the papers down. "Douglas Voss either didn't read the attachment or assumed you hadn't." Hannah let out a breath. "Is it defensible?" she said. "It's not just defensible," Silas said. "It makes his claim frivolous. Any county judge who looked at both documents would say so in under 10 minutes. He looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who had been observing events for 3 months and had formed opinions. "The question is whether you want to simply defend or whether you want to move." "Move," Hannah said. "The lot to the east of your property has been for sale for 2 years, Silas said. "I happen to know the asking price, and I happen to know it's negotiable. If you own that lot, the boundary question becomes moot, and Douglas Voss becomes a man who did extensive research to accomplish nothing." Hannah looked at him. "I don't have that kind of money," she said. "You don't have it now," Silas said. "There are lending arrangements available to people who have demonstrated in the last month or so a capacity for practical judgment that compares favorably to most of the business decisions I've watched this county make." He paused. "I'd be prepared to discuss the terms if you're interested." Hannah looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at the middle distance with the specific expression of a man who had not arranged this conversation, but was not disappointed by where it had gone. "Did you know he was going to say that?" she asked him. "I knew he'd been watching what you've done with the town's relief operation for 3 months, Caleb said. The conclusion he'd reach wasn't hard to predict. "Flattery is not a lending criterion," Silas said dryly. "Results are. Give me an answer by the end of the month." Hannah rode back to town in Joseph's wagon with the deed in her lap and the eastern lot in her mind, and the specific feeling of the ground shifting under her, not destabilizing, but reconfiguring the way it did when the situation changed enough that the map you'd been using no longer described the territory. She was going to need a new map. She thought she might know how to draw one. Saturday's meeting was held at the church hall because Clara Voss had proposed it there, and no one had objected, and because the hall was still the warmest public space in town, after 3 days of having its fire maintained at relief operation levels. Hannah arrived early, not first. Ruth and Mary and Agnes were already there, positioned in the front half of the room with the specific arrangement of women who have discussed their strategy beforehand and are where they are on purpose. Eli was in the back, not because anyone had told him he could attend, but because no one had told him he couldn't, and Hannah had long since stopped trying to exclude him from situations where his presence was useful. The Mill families came. The Pollacks. Joseph carrying the baby with the careful pride of a man who had learned to carry something small and important. Walter Garrett's wife without Walter, who still couldn't manage the cold. Mary's husband the blacksmith. The mill foreman. Caldwell. Dr. Aldridge. Reverend Aldrich, who sat quietly in the back and had the expression of a man who intended to observe and would speak only if the situation required divine intervention. Clara came last. She came alone. Not with Douglas, who was conspicuously absent, possibly because he had found out about Silas Aldrich's review of the deed, and had determined that the county land office strategy was no longer a viable front. Not with Marta Fenwick or the other circle women who had in the last week been coming to their own conclusions about the organization's recent performance. Clara sat in the front row. She did not look at Hannah. Hannah sat on the opposite end of the same row. The meeting opened with Reverend Aldrich saying a brief and non-specific prayer for the community's continued welfare, which was his way of acknowledging that what happened next mattered without putting his thumb on any particular scale. Then Clara stood up. The room went very quiet. Hannah watched her. This was the woman who had looked her in the face 14 months ago and told her the frame was full. This was the woman who had used the word restraint like a weapon, who had gone to Caldwell, who had sent her son to the county land office. Hannah was aware of all of this, with a clarity that was not hatred. She had never been interested in hatred. It required too much maintenance, but was something more like the full, clear knowledge of who a person had been and what they had done. She was going to need to hold both things, that knowledge and whatever came next. Clara stood in front of the hall and looked at the room, and the room looked back at her, and whatever she saw in it evidently told her something she had not permitted herself to fully hear before, because something in her face changed. Not dramatically. Clara was not a dramatic woman. But something shifted in the set of it, some resistance going out of it, replaced by something more tired and more real. "I called this meeting," Clara said, "to discuss the future of the Harvest Aid Circle. I want to begin by saying something before we discuss structure or membership or rules." She stopped. She looked at her hands briefly, then back at the room. The circle failed this community during the December storm. It failed because I had built it around my own sense of who deserved to be helped and who deserved to help. That sense was wrong. She paused. It was wrong because it was based on appearance and not on ability, and because it confused my authority with the community's welfare, which are not the same thing. The hall was so quiet that the sound of the fire in the stove was audible. "There is a woman in this room," Clara said, "who offered her work and her knowledge to this community, repeatedly beginning more than a year ago. I turned her away. I turned her away not once but many times in many ways, some of which were polite enough to pretend they weren't rejections." She still did not look at Hannah. She was looking at the room, which Hannah understood as its own kind of courage, saying this to everyone, rather than only to the person she had wronged. During the worst 3 days this town has seen in a decade. She ran the relief operation from the church hall, delivered a baby in a blizzard, and organized the distribution of resources to every family that needed them. Without a committee, without a budget, without the circle's approval. She stopped. The room waited. "I don't have an explanation for that reflects well on me," Clara said, "so I won't try to provide one." Hannah sat very still. Something was happening inside her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. Not triumph. Not the vindication she might have imagined 14 months ago when she was first turned away from that frame. Something more complicated and more human than vindication. Clara Voss was diminished by this moment, and Hannah found that she did not want Clara Voss diminished. She wanted her changed. Those were different things, and Clara, standing in front of the hall with her hands at her sides and her voice steady, seemed to understand the difference. "What I'm proposing," Clara said, "is not a restructuring of the circle under different management. What I'm proposing is that we dissolve what the circle has been and build something different. Open membership, as I said. Resources managed publicly. Decisions made collectively." She paused. "And I am proposing that Hannah Mercer be asked to sit on the founding committee of whatever we build next, because she has demonstrated that she understands what this community needs better than I have." She sat down. The hall was still quiet. Then Joseph Paulak said from the middle of the room in his careful, deliberate English, "I vote yes." His wife with the baby in her arms said yes. Ruth Hensley said yes. Mary Schaefer said yes. Agnes said yes. The mill foreman said yes. Garrett's wife said yes in a voice that was clearly controlled with some effort. The blacksmith said yes. Caldwell said yes. Dr. Aldridge said yes. Reverend Aldrich from the back said, "The church hall is available for committee meetings on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month," which was his way of saying yes without being counted among the civic votes. Hannah stood. Every head in the room turned toward her. She looked at Clara Voss. Clara met her eyes. Fully, directly, without the practiced neutral expression she had maintained for 14 months. Just a woman looking at another woman across the distance of what had passed between them. "What you said is true," Hannah said. "It is not complete. There are specific things you did that will need to be addressed specifically before I consider them settled. But what you said is true, and I recognize that saying it in front of this room cost you something." She paused. "I will sit on the founding committee." Clara nodded. Once. Hannah sat down. Eli from the back of the room let out a long breath that had apparently been building for some time. The meeting lasted 2 more hours. They argued about membership criteria and resource allocation and decision-making processes with the particular intensity of people who had just had a near miss and were determined to build something that would hold better next time. Hannah and Mary Schaefer drafted the initial structure on the back of 3 envelopes and a page torn from Reverend Aldrich's notebook, which he donated without complaint. When it was done, rough, imperfect a beginning rather than a completion, the room felt different from any room Hannah had sat in Coldwater Creek. Not warmer exactly, just larger, more room in it for people to actually be present. She was pulling on her coat when Caleb appeared at her elbow. She had not seen him come in, but he was there the way he was often, simply there, present without announcement. "How long were you here?" she asked. "Since Joseph said yes," he said. "Did you hear what Clara said?" "Yes," he said. She buttoned her coat. "What did you think?" "I thought it was one of the harder things I've seen someone do in public," he said. "And I thought you handled it exactly right." She looked at him. "I'm tired," she said. "I have been tired for 3 months. I would like very much to go home and sit by the fire and not manage anything for a few hours." "That seems reasonable," he said. "Are you going to walk me home?" she asked. "If you'll let me," he said. She let him. They walked through the cold dark of the December evening, the snow packed hard and blue-white under a clear sky, and they didn't talk about the meeting or Clara or the new committee or the lot to the east or anything that required management. They talked about whether the Aldrich cattle would make it through to spring without losing condition, and whether the spring would be early or late based on what the November grasses had done, which were the kinds of practical questions that had answers and whose answers mattered, and that required nothing from either of them except attention. At her door, she stopped. He stopped beside her. She turned and looked at him in the cold, which she was beginning to understand was where the important things between them always happened, outside in the open, with no furniture to arrange themselves behind. "Ask me," she said. His breath made a small cloud in the air between them. "Miss Hannah Mercer," he said, and the formality of it was not distance. It was the opposite of distance. It was the specific tenderness of a man treating a thing with the full weight it deserved. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him. She thought about the morning she had found him at the feed store, arguing about oats with no audience, and the same voice he'd use for any important truth. She thought about the coffee and the molasses and 2 days of deliberation. She thought about him sitting across the fire while she slept, and tending it, and leaving without waking her, because that was the kind of man he was, present when it mattered, and absent when presence would have been about himself, rather than about her. She thought about the word formally, the intention in it. "Yes," she said. He did not sweep her off her feet. He was not that kind of man, and she was not that kind of woman. He held her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment. The way he looked at things, he wanted to understand accurately, and then he kissed her unhurried, careful reel. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heart going at a pace that suggested that steadiness of his had a cost, and she thought about carrying costs in silence and decided she liked knowing about his. She pulled back. "You understand," she said, "that I'm purchasing the lot to the east of the house." He was close enough that she could see him trying not to smile and not entirely succeeding. "I know," he said. "And that my name will be on the deed," she said. "Obviously," he said. "And that I'm going to sit on this committee, and it's going to take considerable time." Hannah, he said. "Yes. I know who I asked," he said. "I asked you." She looked at him in the cold December dark. She had spent 14 months in this town, being told who she was by people who had never once bothered to ask. She had spent 14 months working in the space they had closed to her building, something out of materials they had overlooked, demonstrating a worth they had already decided she didn't have. And this man had looked at her and asked, had simply asked who she was, and then listened to the answer and loved what he found. She kissed him again briefly, and then she opened her door. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He came in. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table where they had sat over mortar ratios and supply lists and county committee strategies, and outside the cold held the town in its grip, and inside the fire burned, and neither of them said anything for a long while. It was, Hannah thought, the most peaceful evening she had spent in a very long time. She looked at the cedar chest by the door. It was empty now, all 14 quilts gone, distributed in use. She needed to order more batting. She needed to start the spring patterns she had been planning since October. She needed to think about what the new committee's first project should be, and whether Silas Aldrich's loan terms were reasonable, and how to approach the conversation with Dr. Aldrich about the midwifery training she had been thinking about for the last 3 weeks. She needed, in short, to begin. She looked across the table at Caleb, who was drinking his coffee with the focused attention he brought to everything, and who looked up at exactly the moment she was looking at him, and who did not ask what she was thinking, because he had learned that if it was something she wanted him to know, she would tell him. She loved him for that too. "In the spring," she said, "I want to build a proper lending library in the east lot. Just a room to start. Books people can borrow." He considered this seriously. "The Aldriches have a crate of books from Kansas City they've been meaning to donate somewhere," he said. "Silas said so last month. Would he donate them to us?" "I think," Caleb said, "that at this point, Silas Aldrich would donate most things to something you were building." Hannah smiled. It was not a complicated smile, or a cautious one, or the practiced neutral expression she had used for 14 months to move through a town that had not wanted her. It was simple and complete, and entirely her own. "Good," she said. Outside, the December wind moved through Coldwater Creek over the rooftops and across the packed snow over the church hall and the dry goods store and the mill and the long street where the quilts she had made were keeping families warm in the dark. The town was quiet. The worst of winter was past. Something else was beginning. She picked up her coffee cup and thought about spring. Spring came to Coldwater Creek, the way it always did in Kansas, not as a gentle arrival, but as a negotiation. Warm days trading places with cold ones for 6 weeks before the warmth finally won and held. Hannah noticed it first in the quality of the light. The way it came through her window at a different angle, hitting the quilting frame with a gold that had nothing of December in it. She noticed it second in the mud, which was everywhere, which meant the ground was softening, which meant the season was turning, which meant the things she had been planning since she sat at her kitchen table on a December night and told Caleb she wanted to build a lending library were now in the territory of things that could actually be done. She ordered the lumber the first week of March. She had Silas Aldrich's loan terms in writing, signed and witnessed, and the deed to the eastern lot in her name, recorded properly at the county office by a clerk who had handled the transaction with the careful neutrality of a man who was aware of the history and had decided to be professional about it. Douglas Voss had not been present at the recording. No one had seen much of Douglas since January, which Eli reported with the particular satisfaction of a boy who had been paying attention. The framing went up in 2 weeks. Caleb organized the labor ranch hands who had free days, the mill foreman who turned out to have been a carpenter before he was a foreman, Joseph Pawlak, who had built 2 structures in Poland and remembered the principles even if the materials were different. Hannah managed the supplies and the feed schedule and the particular social diplomacy of getting 8 men with different work habits to operate in the same space without losing time to argument. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. The difference now was that no one was pretending otherwise. Ruth Hensley came by on the 3rd day of framing with apple cake, the kind with cinnamon in the batter, and stayed for 4 hours, helping Hannah sort the donated books into categories, which was its own complicated operation, because Silas Aldrich's crate from Kansas City contained everything from agricultural manuals to 3 novels of uncertain literary merit that had clearly been read by multiple people, judging by the state of the spines. "What category is this?" Ruth asked, holding up a book whose title Hannah read and then set back down. "That one," Hannah said, "goes on the high shelf." Ruth looked at the cover again. "Good Lord," she said mildly, and put it on the high shelf. They worked through the afternoon with the sound of hammering outside and the smell of coffee on the stove and the particular easy companionship of women who had been through something hard together and come out the other side, not as friends exactly. That would take longer, and Hannah was not in the habit of accelerating things that needed time, but as people who knew the measure of each other and found it sufficient. Toward the end of the afternoon, Ruth said without particular preamble, "Clara asked me to ask you something." Hannah kept sorting books. "Ask it," she said. "She wants to come by," Ruth said. "Not for the committee, personally. She wants to speak to you privately." Hannah set down the book in her hand. She had been waiting for this in the back of her mind since the December meeting. Clara's public statement had been real. Hannah still believed that the way she believed things she had observed directly rather than heard described. But a public statement was a beginning, not an end. And the specific things Clara had done, the words in the dry goods store, the approach to Caldwell, the county land office business, through her son. Those things had not been named directly. They had circled the edges of the December meeting without being brought to the center. Hannah had been willing to let them wait. She had not been willing to let them disappear. "Tuesday," Hannah said. "Late afternoon. The committee meets in the morning, so she'll know I'm not hiding from her between one and the other." Ruth nodded. She picked up another book, read the title, and placed it in the correct stack with the efficiency of a woman who had made her decision about Hannah Mercer and was now simply doing the work that came with it. On Sunday, Caleb took Hannah to the rebuilt creek crossing east of the ranch. Not for any practical purpose, the crossing was sound, the ranch hands had seen to it in February, there was nothing to inspect. He simply asked her to come, and she came in the wagon that was becoming familiar, the way all things in a life together became familiar with the particular quality of a thing that is yours, because you use it and it holds. He stopped the wagon at the crossing, and they sat for a while in the early March light, listening to the water, which had the full purposeful sound of a creek in spring melt, moving with intention. "I want to set a date," he said. She had been waiting for this too, but less anxiously than she would have expected. She had become in the last 3 months less afraid of the things she was waiting for. Waiting had begun to feel less like holding her breath and more like giving things the space they needed to be what they were going to be. "May," she said. "After the library room is finished. I want to see it complete first." He looked at her. "Why? Because it needs to be done regardless of anything else," she said. "And I don't want the wedding to be the reason I finished it. I want to finish it because it matters on its own terms." He thought about this for a moment. That's sensible, he said. Also, she said, I would like to be married in decent weather. May can go either way in Kansas, he said. I know, she said. I'll take my chances. He took her hand on the seat between them, the way he had taken it at her door in December. Not dramatically, just the way a man held the hand of a woman he intended to build the rest of his life beside. She let him. The creek ran past them, cold and clear and full. She thought about the first time she had sat at her quilting frame with the church hall blazing through the window. The sound of laughter she was excluded from drifting across the snow. She thought about the distance between that night and this one, not the time exactly, but the weight of it, the thing that had happened in the space between. She had not become a different person. That was the important thing. She was exactly who she had been on that November evening, with her needle and her candle and her 9 quilts in the cedar chest. The world around her had changed. The world had been shown what she already was. Caleb, she said. Yes, he said. I want you to know something. She watched the water. I am not a simple woman to love. I know that. I am opinionated, and I work too many hours, and I find it genuinely difficult to ask for help, and those things are not going to change because we are married. I know, he said. I want to make sure you know, she said. Before May. Howe was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet that meant he was considering what she'd said with the seriousness it deserved, rather than rushing to reassure her. I loved Thomas, he said finally. My partner. After he died, I made every decision that should have been made for him. I controlled everything I could reach. I told myself it was responsibility. He paused. What I understand now is that control is not love. Control is what you do when you're afraid of what happens if you aren't controlling. He looked at her. You are the first person I've been close to in 9 years where I haven't been afraid of the space between us. Where I've wanted the space between us because what lives in it is actually you. He paused again. So when you tell me you're opinionated and you work too hard and you find it difficult to ask for help, those are not warnings. Those are the person I asked. Hannah looked at him. She thought about the thing she had told Ruth Hensley. Kindness without respect is only disguised pity. She thought about how long she had gone without being looked at with genuine respect, how deeply she had internalized the town's assessment as at least a partial truth about herself, even as she fought it. How much energy it had cost her all that fighting. She was tired of fighting things that were not true. All right, she said. May. He squeezed her hand once. They sat until the light changed and then drove back to town. Clara came on Tuesday. She came at the time Hannah specified, which was itself information. Clara Moss was a woman who set the terms of things, and arriving at someone else's specified time was an act of subordination she had apparently decided to perform deliberately. She sat at Hannah's kitchen table. Hannah poured coffee. Clara looked at the coffee cup for a moment. Then she looked at Hannah. I had a conversation with Douglas last week, she said. Hannah sat down across from her. He told me what he did at the county land office, Clara said. I want you to know I did not ask him to do that. I know you didn't, Hannah said. Clara looked slightly surprised. You know, she said. It was too visible, Hannah said. Too crude. You don't operate that way. You use words and social structure. What Douglas did was a legal maneuver, which is a different instrument. She paused. You also didn't tell him not to. Clara was quiet. No, she said. I didn't. Why not? Hannah asked. This was the question that mattered. This was the one that the December meeting had circled, without answering the one that Clara's carefully worded public statement had approached but not reached. Hannah was not going to let it stay unasked. Clara turned the coffee cup in her hands. This was Hannah noticed the same gesture Caleb made when he was thinking something he hadn't decided whether to say. She had not expected to find a similarity between them. Because I was angry, Clara said. And I was afraid. And when Douglas told me what he'd found, I was glad, and then I said nothing, which is the same as permission. She set the cup down. I have spent 15 years believing that the standards I set for this circle were what kept this town functional. That without those standards, without people knowing their place and keeping it, everything would come apart. She stopped. What the December storm showed me was that I had confused my position with those standards. I told myself I was protecting order. What I was actually protecting was my authority. Hannah listened. She let the silence after that statement stand for a moment because it deserved to stand. "There is something specific I need you to say," Hannah said. "Not to the room, to me." Clara met her eyes. "The dry goods store," Hannah said. "What you said to Caldwell, and the words you said in the street when I was walking home from the church hall." She kept her voice level, the way she kept it level for important things. "Those were not organizational decisions. Those were personal attacks. You used my body to discredit me with one person and to humiliate me with another. And you did it in public, and I need you to name what those things were before I consider the rest." Clara's jaw worked. For a moment, Hannah thought she might retreat into qualification, into the language of misjudgment and hasty decisions. That was the vocabulary of people who wanted the credit of apology without the weight of admission. Clara did not retreat. "I was cruel to you," Clara said. "Specifically and deliberately. I used your appearance because I knew it was the thing that would be most effective, and because I had watched this town accept that kind of cruelty as normal for so long that I didn't believe anyone would call it what it was." She paused. "I was also wrong about you. Not just wrong in judgment. Wrong in a way that cost people. The families who went into that storm without adequate preparation, that is partly on me because I refused to use your knowledge, because of how you look." Her voice was steady, but Hannah could hear what steadiness was costing her. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am asking you to let me work in whatever structure you build so that I can demonstrate something different over time." Hannah looked at Clara Voss for a long moment. She thought about what Mary had said. Clara's position is weaker than she knows. She had been right, but the weakness had not produced the collapse. Hannah might have expected. It had produced something more interesting. A woman who had discovered the difference between the authority she'd claimed and the leadership she'd never quite managed, and who was choosing however late and however imperfectly to try to close that distance. It was not enough. It was not trust restored or friendship or anything that would come easily or quickly. But it was real. Hannah could tell the difference between performance and reality. She had had considerable practice. "Come to the committee meetings," Hannah said. "Do the work. Let the work speak." She paused. "And the next time you see a woman in this town being diminished for how her body looks, you say something. Publicly. That is what I require from you going forward." Clara nodded. "I can do that," she said. "I know you can," Hannah said. "The question has always been whether you would." Clara left. Hannah sat alone at the table for a few minutes. Not triumphant, not relieved. Just honest with herself about what had happened. A door had been opened that could not be closed again, and the opening of it had cost both of them something. And what came next would be built on that cost imperfectly, and over time, the way all real things were built. She picked up her coffee cup and went out to check on the library framing. The walls were going up straight. The library room was finished on the 14th of April. It was a single room, wood-framed with 2 windows that faced east and south, a wood stove in the corner, 3 shelves along the north wall, and a table in the center, large enough to seat 6 people. The floor was rough-cut pine. The door had a proper latch that Caleb had made himself at the blacksmith's forge, because he had decided that the door latch was a thing he wanted to contribute specifically, and he had made it twice before the second version satisfied him. Hannah ran her hand along the shelves the day they were installed and thought about all the rooms she had been excluded from, and considered that this one was different because she had built it, and anyone who came through its door was welcome by definition because she had made it so. Silas Aldrich donated the books as promised. Mary Schaefer donated a rag rug. Eli built 2 of the chairs at the mill on his own time, imperfectly, but structurally sound, and refused payment. The Pollack children showed up on the first morning. The room was open, and sat at the table, looking at picture books, with the specific reverence of children who understood they were somewhere important. Joseph Pollack stood in the doorway watching his children, and said in his careful English, "This is a good thing." "Yes," Hannah said. It is. He looked at her. In Poland, he said, my mother could not read. She said it was the one door she could never open. He watched his daughter turn a page. Marta can read. My children will read, because of this room. Hannah did not say anything for a moment. The room belongs to whoever needs it, she said finally. That's all it needs to be. He nodded the nod of a man who understood exactly what she meant and found it sufficient. She went back to sorting the new donations that had come in over the last 2 weeks. 3 more families had sent books, which she was beginning to think of as the community voting with what they had for a thing they wanted to exist. The community was voting in other ways too. The new relief committee had met 4 times since December, and each meeting had been more functional than the last. The membership list now included 22 women and 6 men, which Clara had not objected to the men being there, having apparently crossed some internal threshold that the December crisis had lowered permanently. The distribution records were public and posted at the church and the dry goods store. The decisions were made by vote, which sometimes produced outcomes Clara disagreed with, and which she had managed to accept with the specific grace of a woman practicing something she was not yet natural at. Hannah watched Clara at the meetings, the way she watched all things. She was trying to accurately understand. The anger in her had not disappeared. She did not expect it to disappear. What she had discovered was that anger and fairness could occupy the same space if she was deliberate about it, that she could see Clara clearly, all of her, including what she had done, and still work beside her because the work was not about Clara. The work was about the town. That was the distinction that held. The wedding was on the 10th of May. The weather made its usual Kansas compromise cold enough in the morning that Hannah wore 2 petticoats and was glad of it warm enough by afternoon that the outdoor ceremony Reverend Aldrich conducted was possible without anyone losing fingers to frostbite. They were married in the yard beside the library room, which was Hannah's choice, and which Caleb accepted without question, because he had learned by now that Hannah's choices about location and time and the details of things were never arbitrary. She wore her best dress, not her wedding dress, because she had not owned a wedding dress and had declined to purchase one on the grounds that she had better uses for that money, a position that Caleb had supported and that Ruth Hensley had initially argued with and then conceded when Hannah pointed out that the library table had cost approximately the same as a dress she would wear once. She wore her good blue dress, and she put her hair up, and she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Eli had gone into the east field to collect at 6 in the morning, and had delivered to her door with the expression of a boy who was trying to look as though this was a perfectly normal errand. She had cried then briefly alone in her kitchen, because Eli was 17, and he had spent 4 months being the most useful person she had ever worked with, and she loved him with the uncomplicated affection of a woman who recognized a good person in the process of becoming themselves. She dried her eyes and put up her hair and carried the wildflowers to the yard. Caleb was already there. He looked at her, the way he looked at things he wanted to understand accurately, and then his expression did the thing. It sometimes went beyond the careful control into something more open, something she was still learning to read. "You look beautiful," he said. "You've seen me before," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have." He held out his hand. "That's why I know." She took his hand. The ceremony was short. Reverend Aldrich, who had been watching events in Coldwater Creek since November, with the patient attention of a man who believed in allowing things to work themselves out with occasional divine assistance, kept it to what was essential and did not add anything that wasn't required. The people who came were the people who had been through December with them: Ruth and Mary and Agnes, the Mill families. The Pollacks with the baby, who was now 4 months old and had been named Clara by a joke that only Marta fully appreciated. Joseph, looking quietly proud. Walter Garrett on his own feet for the first time at a public event, leaning on a cane but standing Aldridge beside him, looking satisfied in the way of doctors whose patience defied expectations. Eli in his best shirt, which he had clearly pressed himself, and imperfectly. The Aldrich's Silas in his good coat. The blacksmith and his wife. Caldwell. Clara Voss came. She stood at the back, and she said nothing, and she left after the ceremony without making a production of her presence or her departure. She brought nothing, and asked for nothing, and offered nothing except her presence, which was itself a kind of statement that Hannah understood without requiring it to be translated. She did not go out of her way to acknowledge Clara. She also did not pretend she hadn't come. The thing that happened at the wedding reception, held in the library room, which was exactly large enough for the purpose, and which Hannah had decided was the right space for the same reason she had held the ceremony beside, it was not something she had planned. It happened because Eli brought someone. He arrived with a girl, a young woman 20 years old or thereabouts, dark-haired with the watchful, self-contained manner of someone who had learned to evaluate situations quickly. She was heavy-set, broad-shouldered, with strong hands, and the particular posture of a woman who had spent time being made to feel she took up too much room and had not yet decided whether to apologize for it or stop. Eli brought her in and looked at Hannah with the expression of a boy who was not certain he had done the right thing, but had done it anyway because it seemed important. "This is Frances," he said. "She came in on the afternoon stage. The hotel wouldn't give her a room." Hannah looked at him. "Why not?" she asked. Eli's jaw tightened. "They said they were full. They weren't full." Hannah looked at Frances. Frances was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had been assessed and found wanting enough times that she had learned to detect the moment of assessment and brace for its result. Hannah stepped forward. She held out her hand. "Hannah Mercer," she said. "Dyer as of this afternoon. Welcome." Frances shook her hand. Her grip was good. "I don't mean to intrude," Frances said. "Eli said he said you might know of work. I'm not afraid of work. I can cook, I can clean, I can do heavy lifting. I learn fast. I just need—" "Where are you coming from?" Hannah asked. "Topeka," Frances said. "Before that, Ohio." She stopped. "I've been looking for a place that might give me a real chance. Eli wrote to me." She stopped again and looked at Eli, who was doing his best to look like this had been a casual mention rather than a deliberate campaign. Hannah looked at Eli. "You wrote to her," Hannah said. "I may have mentioned that Coldwater Creek had changed somewhat," Eli said. "In terms of who got a fair chance." "When did you write this letter?" "January," Eli said with the specific expression of a boy who knew he had acted without permission and had decided the outcome justified it. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Frances. She thought about what she had told Joseph Paulak. The room belongs to whoever needs it. She thought about the rules she had been drafting for the new committee, the specific language she had fought for no person excluded on the basis of appearance. She thought about every door that had been closed to her, every room she had been made to stand outside of every time someone had looked at her body and decided it told them everything they needed to know about her value. She was not going to be the person who stood in a doorway. "The library has a storeroom," Hannah said. "It's small, and it's not much, but it's warm and dry, and it's available until we sort out something more suitable. The committee meets Tuesday morning, and I will put your situation to them directly." She paused. "And in the meantime, you'll eat with us, and you'll tell me what work you're actually good at, because Eli tends toward enthusiasm, and I prefer accuracy." Frances looked at her. Something in her face was doing what Eli's face had done the night Hannah gave him the quilt, moving through several things quickly and settling somewhere that had not yet decided whether to be hopeful. "You don't know me," Frances said. "No," Hannah said. "But I've been in your position, and I know what it costs to stand in a doorway and wait to see if someone will open it." She stepped aside from the door of the library room. "Come in." Frances came in. The room was warm. The fire was going. The people gathered inside were talking and laughing and eating, and the shelves along the north wall were full of books, and the Pollack children were sitting under the table with a picture book, and Walter Garrett was telling the mill foreman something that was apparently very funny because the foreman was laughing hard enough to spill his coffee. Frances stopped in the middle of it and looked around with the particular expression of someone encountering something they had not expected. Caleb came to stand beside Hannah. He looked at Frances, then at Hannah, then at Eli, and understood the sequence of events with the efficiency of a man who had been paying attention for months. He picked up Frances's bag from where she had set it by the door. "The storeroom's this way," he said simply. "Come on, I'll show you where the extra blankets are." Frances looked at him, at Hannah, back at Caleb. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank us," Caleb said with the straightforward practicality that Hannah had come to understand as his most consistent form of kindness. "Come on." He led her through the room. Hannah watched him go. This man she had married 4 hours ago, carrying a stranger's bag to a storeroom at his own wedding reception, without making a production of it, because it was the obvious right thing to do, and he was not in the habit of requiring acknowledgement for obvious right things. She loved him with a completeness that still occasionally surprised her. Ruth Hensley appeared at her elbow. "Who is that?" Ruth asked. "Frances," Hannah said. "She's going to be staying for a while." Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the room. The people in it. The fire. The books on the shelves. The Pollack baby, asleep in her mother's arms. Eli already talking to Frances with the animated energy of a boy who had written a letter in January and spent 3 months hoping it would work out. "Hannah," Ruth said. "Yes," Hannah said. "What you have built here," Ruth said. "In 7 months, starting with nothing except your work and your stubbornness." She stopped. "I want you to know that I understand what I was part of before, and I want you to know that I intend to spend a long time making that mean something different." Hannah looked at her. "Then start Tuesday," Hannah said. "The committee meets at 9. Bring your account book and whatever you know about the spring seed situation, because I have been hearing things about the East Fields that concern me, and I want fresh eyes on it." Ruth almost smiled. It was the closest thing to humor Hannah had seen from her. "Yes," Ruth said. "All right." She went back to the group. Hannah stood at the edge of the room for a moment and looked at what the last 7 months had made. Not a perfect town. Not a town without cruelty or prejudice or the particular smallness that came from people who had lived in one place long enough to believe their assumptions were facts. Coldwater Creek was still all of those things and would be for some time. And Hannah was not so sentimental as to believe that one hard winter had permanently reformed a community that had spent 15 years building its social order on the wrong foundation. But there was a library room that had not existed in October. There was a committee that voted instead of a woman who decided. There was a storeroom with blankets where a girl from Topeka was putting down her bag. There was a cedar chest that had been empty since December and was already filling again, because Hannah had ordered more batting in February and the new quilts were growing by inches every night. And there was Caleb coming back from the storeroom, moving through the crowded room, with the particular quality of a man who was entirely at home, stopping to say something to Joseph, touching the back of Hannah's hand briefly as he passed before going to help Silas with whatever Silas had gotten himself into in the corner with the coffee urn. Hannah looked at all of it. She thought about the November night when she had sat alone with her needle and her candle and her 9 quilts, and the sound of other people's laughter. And she thought about the distance between that night and this one, and she thought about what it had cost to cross that distance, and what it had built. She thought about what she would tell Frances when the time was right about how this town had changed, and how it hadn't, and what the difference was between a place that tolerated you and a place that actually saw you. She would tell her the truth. She would tell her that no one had handed her a seat at any table, that she had built the table herself, one stitch at a time in the dark alone, while everyone she was building it for told her she wasn't capable of the work. She would tell her that the people who excluded her had done so out of fear, and that fear was the cruelest judge a person could face, because it had nothing to do with who you actually were. And she would tell her that the morning comes. It always eventually comes. The fire popped in the stove. Marta's baby made a sound of contentment. Someone laughed Eli the specific bright laugh of a boy who was becoming a man and didn't quite know it yet. The books on the shelves stood in their rows, patient and full of what people had thought and known and imagined across all the years since someone first understood that a mark could carry a meaning. Outside, May light was warm on the Kansas grass. Inside, Coldwater Creek was learning one difficult day at a time what it meant to become the kind of place that deserved the people it had always had. Hannah Mercer. Dyer picked up her coffee cup, looked around the room she had built, and was not afraid of a single thing inside it. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had always been.